At the airport, my son looked me in the eye and said, "Wait here, Dad. I will go get the wheelchair." I sat on that cold metal bench and watched him walk away into the crowd. 45 minutes later, I was still sitting there. No son, no wheelchair, no luggage. But there was one thing they did not count on. That morning when my daughter-in-law handed me my daily medicine, I did not swallow it. I spit it into my napkin. As the fog in my brain began to lift, I realized they had not just lost me. They had dumped me. I stood up, gripping my cane, and touched the watch on my wrist. I did not have a ticket, but I was about to take them on a journey they would never forget. Before I tell you how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who you are. My name is Langston Barnes. I am 72 years old, and for 30 years, I was a structural engineer in Chicago. I calculated the load-bearing capacity of steel beams for high rises. I knew exactly how much weight a foundation could hold before it cracked. But sitting there in Terminal 3 of O'Hare International Airport, I realized I had miscalculated the structural integrity of my own family. The automatic doors slid open and closed, letting in blasts of freezing January air that cut right through my wool coat. The terminal was a river of people flowing past me. Businessmen in suits shouting into phones, mothers dragging toddlers, students with backpacks. They all had a destination. I was the only one who was stationary. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10:14 in the morning. Trey had left me at 9:30. He said he was going to find a wheelchair attendant. He said my hip was acting up and he didn't want me walking to the gate. He smiled when he said it. That nervous, twitchy smile he gets when he is lying. I should have seen it. I should have seen the way his eyes darted to the exit signs instead of the check-in counters. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against a small, hard object. I pulled it out. It was a little blue pill. Brittany, my daughter-in-law, had given it to me at breakfast. She called it a memory supplement. She said it would help with the confusion. For the past 6 months, I have been living in a fog. I would walk into a room and forget why I was there. I would lose my keys. I would struggle to do simple math in my head. They told me it was early onset dementia. They told me I was fading away. But yesterday, I saw Brittany grinding something into my coffee. She thought I was asleep in the recliner, but my eyes were open just a crack. I didn't drink the coffee. And this morning, when she put this blue pill on my tongue and handed me a glass of orange juice, I pretended to swallow. I tucked it into my cheek, and when she turned to grab her purse, I spit it into my handkerchief. I held the pill up to the fluorescent light of the airport terminal. It wasn't a vitamin. I didn't know what it was exactly, but now that it wasn't in my system, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. The noise in the airport wasn't a chaotic roar anymore. I could distinguish individual sounds, the screech of suitcase wheels, the drone of the announcement system, the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked at the steel truss supporting the ceiling above me. I immediately calculated the tension load. The math was effortless. I wasn't senile. I was drugged. A cold fury started to spread through my chest, hotter than the coffee I didn't drink. I looked around for my carry-on bag. It was gone. Trey had taken it. I patted my jacket pocket where I kept my wallet. Empty. I checked the inside pocket for my passport. Gone. I remembered the car ride over. The way Brittany had turned around from the front seat, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. "Dad," she had said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Why don't you let Trey hold your documents? You know how chaotic the airport is. We don't want you losing them like you lost your house keys last week." I had handed them over. I had handed over my identity, my money, and my phone because I trusted them. Because I believed the lie that I was broken. Now I sat there, a 72-year-old black man in a busy airport with no ID, no money, and no ticket. To the passing security guards, I looked like just another confused senior citizen who had been separated from his group. If I went to the police, they would look me up in the system. They would see the medical reports Brittany had likely falsified. They would call my son. Trey would come back, acting the worried hero, saying, "Oh, thank God you found him. He wandered off. He is very sick." And then they would put me in a home. That was the plan. Leave me here confused and helpless until the authorities took over and they could wash their hands of me while keeping my assets. I gripped the handle of my cane. It was solid hickory. I squeezed it until my knuckles hurt. No, I was not going to be a victim in their narrative. I stood up. My hip ached a dull throb that reminded me of my age, but my legs were strong. I walked toward the exit. I didn't look for Trey. I knew he wasn't there. He and Brittany were probably halfway back to Bronzeville by now, popping a bottle of champagne, celebrating the disposal of the old man. I walked out into the biting Chicago wind. The sky was the color of a bruise. Snow flurries were swirling around the concrete pillars. The taxi line was long, full of people with vouchers and credit cards. I didn't have either. I walked past the official taxi stand to the far end of the arrivals lane where the gypsy cabs and the hustlers waited. I needed a ride, and I needed it off the books. A beat-up Lincoln Town car was idling by the curb. The driver was a big man huddled in a thick parka, smoking a cigarette with the window cracked. He looked like he had seen everything this city had to offer and didn't like any of it. I tapped on the glass with my cane. He rolled the window down an inch. He eyed my coat, which was high-quality wool, and my posture, which was military straight. "You looking for a ride, Pops?" he asked, smoke curling out into the cold air. "I need to go to Bronzeville," I said. 45th and King Drive. $70, the driver said. "Cash up front." "I don't have cash," I said. The window started to roll up. "Have a nice day, Pops." "Wait," I said. I jammed the tip of my cane into the gap, preventing the window from closing. The driver flinched, reaching for something under his seat. "I don't have cash," I repeated, keeping my voice steady and low. "But I have this." I pulled up the sleeve of my coat. On my left wrist sat a Rolex Submariner. It was the 1990 model stainless steel with a black dial. It was the watch Lucille, my late wife, had given me the day I retired. It was engraved on the back to Langston, my iron and steel. The driver's eyes widened. He knew what he was looking at. Even scratched and worn, that watch was worth $5,000 easy. "I will give you this watch," I said, "for a ride to Bronzeville, and $20 in change so I can buy a screwdriver." The driver laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You kidding me, old-timer? That watch is probably fake." I took it off. The clasp clicked open. I handed it to him through the crack in the window. "Feel the weight," I said. "It is heavy. Real steel. Look at the second hand. It sweeps. It doesn't tick." He held it up, inspecting it with the greed of a shark sensing blood. He looked at me, then back at the watch. "You stole this?" he asked. "It is mine," I said. "But right now, time is not as important to me as location. Do we have a deal?" He unlocked the doors. "Get in." I climbed into the back seat. The car smelled of stale tobacco and pine air freshener. It was a long way from the leather seats of the luxury SUV my son drove. But as the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the highway traffic, I felt a grim satisfaction. I looked out the window as the airport faded behind me. Trey had taken my wallet. He had taken my passport. He had taken my luggage. But he had forgotten to take the one thing that mattered. He had forgotten to take my mind. He thought he had left a senile old man on a bench. He didn't know he was driving away from a man who had built bridges that could withstand hurricanes. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror. "You in trouble, Pops?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. "No," I said, staring at the gray skyline of Chicago approaching in the distance. "I am not in trouble. I am the trouble." The car sped up. I closed my eyes and let the plan form in my head. Structural engineering is all about finding the weak point. Every building has one. Every lie has one. My son and his wife had built a life on a foundation of greed and deception. They thought their structure was sound. I was going home to show them just how fragile it really was. The Lincoln Town car rattled over the potholes of Martin Luther King Drive, the suspension groaning in protest against the frozen asphalt. I sat in the back, rubbing the pale band of skin on my wrist where my Rolex used to be. The driver, a man who went by the name of Smoke, glanced at me in the rearview mirror every few blocks. He didn't ask questions. He just drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping ash out the window. We passed the gray stone two-flats and the historic boulevards of Bronzeville. This was my neighborhood. This was the Black Metropolis. I had walked these streets when they were burning in '68, and I had walked them when they were rebuilding in the '90s. Every brick in this district held a story, but none of them prepared me for the story unfolding in my own home. We pulled up to the curb in front of number 4512. My house. It was a classic Chicago brownstone built in 1910 with a limestone facade that I had tuck-pointed myself 15 years ago. It stood tall and stoic against the gray winter sky, the iron fence guarding the small patch of frozen earth where Lucille used to plant her tulips. From the outside, it looked exactly the same as it had when I left it 3 hours ago. The curtains were drawn, the porch light was off. It looked peaceful. It looked like a sanctuary. I thanked Smoke and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped down the street, stinging my cheeks, but I barely felt it. My internal temperature was rising with every step I took toward the front gate. I gripped my cane, listening to the metallic clack, clack, clack of the tip against the pavement. I wasn't just an old man coming home. I was an engineer inspecting a site that had suffered a catastrophic failure. I walked up the 7 concrete steps to the front porch. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from exertion, but from a growing, gnawing suspicion. I reached for the heavy oak door, expecting it to be locked but prepared with my backup plan. For 20 years, ever since Trey was a boy, losing his latchkey every other week, I had kept a spare key hidden under the heavy ceramic pot of the hydrangeas to the left of the door. It was a cliché, I know, but it was our cliché, a secret between a father and a son. I shifted the heavy pot with the toe of my boot. There was nothing there, just a circle of damp, stained concrete. I frowned, crouching down despite the protest in my hip. I ran my gloved hand over the cold stone. Maybe it had slid. Maybe the wind had moved it. But there was nothing. The key was gone. I stood up and turned to the door itself. I reached for the lock, intending to pick it if I had to. I had learned a thing or two about tumblers in my line of work, but my hand froze before it touched the metal. The old brass deadbolt, a solid piece of hardware I had installed in 1985, was gone. In its place sat a sleek black panel with a glass screen, a biometric fingerprint scanner. I stared at it, my breath clouding in the air. You don't install a biometric lock in 3 hours. This required wiring. It required drilling into the frame. This had been done days ago, maybe weeks ago. They must have installed it while I was sleeping or while Brittany took me to one of those endless doctor appointments for my imaginary dementia. They had locked me out of my own castle before I even left the gates. I didn't pound on the door. Pounding is what desperate people do. I wasn't desperate, I was calculating. I stepped back and moved to the bay window on the right. The curtains were drawn, but there was a sliver of a gap where the fabric didn't quite meet in the middle. I stepped into the mulch of the flower bed, my boots sinking into the semi-frozen mud. I leaned in close, shielding my eyes from the glare of the winter sun, and peered through the glass. The scene inside made my blood run cold. I expected to see an empty house. I expected to see suitcases by the door, maybe a note on the counter. I expected to see signs of a family that had left in a hurry to catch a flight to Italy, a trip I was paying for. Instead, I saw an industry. The living room furniture, Lucille's antique Victorian sofa, the mahogany coffee table, the grandfather's clock was all there. But it wasn't arranged for living. It was pushed against the walls. And on every single item, there was a neon green sticker. I squinted. The stickers had numbers on them. Lot 401, Lot 402, and there were price tags. Big, bold, handwritten tags. My eyes swept the room. The 2 burly men in blue coveralls were lifting my leather recliner, the chair I sat in every night to read the newspaper. They were laughing as they hauled it toward the kitchen, presumably to the service entrance. And standing in the center of the room, holding a clipboard and barking orders, was Brittany. She wasn't wearing her travel clothes. She was wearing her realtor blazer, that sharp navy blue armor she wore when she was closing a deal. She pointed at the oil painting of my great-grandfather hanging above the fireplace. She snapped her fingers at the movers and made a slashing motion across her throat. Take it down. They were stripping the house. They weren't just selling the furniture. They were erasing the history. They were liquidating 40 years of life while I was supposedly sitting at an airport gate waiting for a wheelchair. But where was Trey? My eyes scanned the room frantically. Was he upstairs packing? Was he perhaps feeling guilty hiding in his old room? Then I saw him. He walked in from the dining room. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was wearing one of my cashmere sweaters, the beige one I bought for special occasions. He looked comfortable. He looked like the lord of the manor. In his hand he held a bottle of wine. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass. I recognized the label instantly. It was a 1982 Chateau Margaux. I had bought that bottle for Lucille on our 25th anniversary. We never opened it. We were saving it for our golden anniversary. After she died, I kept it on the top shelf of the cellar, a sacred relic of a love that never got to finish its story. Trey held the bottle by the neck. He didn't use a coaster. He just slammed it down on the dining table right next to a stack of my engineering blueprints that were being used as coasters for coffee cups. He was laughing. His head was thrown back, his mouth open in a wide, ugly guffaw. I couldn't hear him through the double-paned storm windows. I needed to hear him. I needed to know the depth of the betrayal. I noticed the window wasn't fully latched. The old sash weights were loose. I had been meaning to fix them for months. I took the tip of my cane and wedged it under the frame. I applied gentle, steady pressure, leveraging the fulcrum like the engineer I was. The window groaned and slid up just half an inch. The sounds of the house drifted out to me, the squeak of rubber boots on hardwood, the tearing of packing tape, and Trey's voice. So I told him, "Dad, just sit tight, I'll be right back." You should have seen him, Brittany. He looked like a lost puppy, just sitting there clutching his little bag. I watched Brittany laugh as she checked something off her clipboard. Did he suspect anything? Trey poured the dark red wine into a water glass, a common water glass. No, babe. He was so doped up on the meds he probably thought we were already in Rome. By the time the fog clears, if it ever clears, security will have picked him up. And what happens when they call us? Brittany asked, not looking up from her list. Trey took a long, slurping swig of the vintage wine. I winced. He was drinking $500 a sip like it was grape juice. "We don't answer," Trey said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "We let it go to voicemail. Then in a few hours we call the police and report him missing. We play the grieving, frantic children. Oh, officer, he wandered off. He has severe dementia. We are so worried." He walked over to the window, staring right at me, but looking through me, focused on his own reflection in the glass. "By tonight, social services will have him in the system as a John Doe or a ward of the state. They'll stick him in one of those overflow facilities on the west side. You know, the ones that smell like bleach and urine. He won't last a month." Brittany walked over and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're a genius, baby." And the house sold. Trey grinned. "I have a cash buyer coming at noon tomorrow. We liquidate the contents today, sign the deed tomorrow, and by Monday we are on a beach in Turks and Caicos with $500,000 in the bag." He raised the glass of wine in a mock toast to the empty room. "Here's to Langston Barnes," he sneered. "Great engineer, terrible judge of character." He downed the rest of the wine. I stood there in the freezing mud, my hand gripping the windowsill so hard a splinter drove itself into my palm. I didn't feel the pain. I didn't feel the cold. I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike on this very sidewalk. The boy I had sat up with when he had fevers. The boy I had put through college, bailing him out of debt, covering his mistakes, loving him despite his mediocrity. I realized in that moment that my son had died a long time ago. The man standing in my living room wearing my sweater and drinking my wife's wine was a stranger, a parasite, a monster wearing a familiar face. He thought I was wandering a terminal, confused and helpless. He thought I was a structural problem he had finally solved by demolition. But he forgot one thing about his father. I don't just build things. I know how to take them down. I know where the load-bearing walls are. I know that if you remove just one critical pin, the whole house comes down. I slowly lowered the window. I stepped back out of the flower bed, wiping the mud from my boots. I wasn't going to call the police. The police would just file a report. They would treat this as a civil dispute. No. This required a different kind of justice. I walked around the side of the house toward the backyard. Trey thought he had locked me out, but he didn't know about the ventilation shaft I had reinforced in 1968 during the riots. He didn't know about the subterranean access I had built when I was terrified the world was going to burn down around us. I was going to enter my own house. I was going to descend into the foundation, and I was going to bring the roof down on their heads. I stood in the freezing mud of my own backyard, staring at the limestone foundation of the house I had bought in 1974. The wind off the lake was picking up, howling through the bare branches of the oak tree I had planted when Trey was born. That tree was strong now. Its roots went deep. But the boy I planted it for had rotted from the inside out. I did not go to the back door. I knew Trey. He was lazy, but Brittany was thorough. She would have changed the locks on the back entrance too, or at least bolted it from the inside. They expected me to be an old man. They expected me to pound on the door and beg to be let in. They expected a father. But they were not dealing with a father anymore. They were dealing with a structural engineer. And an engineer knows that every fortress has a weakness. You just have to know the history of the build. I walked to the corner of the house near the chimney breast where the shadows were deepest. Overgrown hydrangeas masked the foundation here. I pushed through the brittle dead branches, ignoring the thorns that snagged my wool coat. I knelt down my bad hip, screaming in protest, sending white-hot, jagged lines of pain up my spine. I gritted my teeth and forced myself into the dirt. There it was, a rusted iron grate set low into the stone, almost invisible against the dark earth. To anyone else, it looked like an old coal chute sealed up decades ago. But I knew better. In 1968, when the riots following Dr. King's assassination set the West Side on fire, Lucille was pregnant. I was terrified. The world felt like it was ending. So when I renovated the heating system, I didn't seal this shaft, I reinforced it. I built a hidden latch mechanism accessible only by sliding a thin piece of steel between the bricks. It was my panic room before panic rooms existed. It was my escape hatch. I pulled a small flathead screwdriver from the pocket of the trousers I had bought from the airport gift shop before my son abandoned me. I slid it into the mortar joint 3 bricks above the grate. I felt the tip hit the hidden lever. I applied torque. Clank. The sound was dull and heavy, buried in the earth. The latch released. I gripped the iron bars of the grate. They were cold enough to burn my skin. I pulled. The hinges groaned, a sound of protesting metal that hadn't moved in 40 years, but they gave way. The grate swung open, revealing a square black mouth leading into the belly of my home. I looked into the darkness. It smelled of wet earth, mildew, and old secrets. It was a tight squeeze. I was 72 years old. My joints were calcified, my muscles were tired. But looking into that hole, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, calculated rage that lubricated every movement. I took off my heavy coat and pushed it into the hole first. Then I lay on my stomach in the freezing mud. I shimmied forward head first. The space was suffocating. The galvanized steel of the ductwork pressed against my shoulders. Dust bunnies the size of rats brushed against my face. I had to pull myself along by my elbows, dragging my dead weight inch by agonizing inch. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through my hips. I bit my lip until I tasted copper to keep from crying out. Just like the job site, Langston, I told myself. Inspect the weld, check the load, keep moving. I crawled about 10 feet until the shaft widened where it joined the main intake for the old furnace. I paused to catch my breath, lying there in the absolute dark, listening to the house breathe. And then I heard it. The ductwork acted like a giant speaking tube, carrying sound from the rooms above with terrifying clarity. I heard the click of high heels on hardwood. Brittany. She was directly above me in the kitchen. I held my breath, forcing my heart to slow down so the sound of my own pulse wouldn't drown her out. "No, do not lower the price," she was saying. Her voice was sharp metallic, echoing through the vent. "I don't care what the inspection says. The market is hot. We list it as is. Cash offers only." There was a pause. She was listening to someone on the other end. "Listen to me," she snapped. "We need liquidity by Friday. Yes, Friday. The old man is gone. He is confused. He wandered off at O'Hare. By the time social services processes him, he will be in a state facility, and we will have power of attorney over the estate." I squeezed my eyes shut. The old man is gone. She spoke of me as if I were a piece of luggage lost in transit. "No," she continued, her voice dropping lower, conspiratorial. "Trey is fine. He is a little shaken up, but he will do what I tell him. He always does. Just get the paperwork ready. We are selling everything. The house, the vintage car, the portfolio. We are cashing out." I heard the sound of a refrigerator door opening, then the pop of a cork. "Make it happen," she said. "I want this money in an offshore account before the weekend." The call ended. I heard her sigh, a long, satisfied exhale. Then she hummed a little tune. She was happy. She was celebrating the liquidation of my life while standing in my kitchen drinking my wine. I lay there in the dark tears of rage mixing with the dust on my face. They weren't just greedy. They were erasing me. They were scrubbing Langston Barnes from the face of the earth so they could consume what I had built. I started crawling again, faster this time. The pain didn't matter anymore. The pain was fuel. I reached the end of the horizontal shaft. Now came the hard part, a 4-foot drop into the boiler room. I maneuvered my legs forward, twisting my body in the tight space. I hung from the lip of the duct for a second, feeling gravity pull at my old bones. Then I let go. I landed on the concrete floor with a heavy thud. My knees buckled and I collapsed, rolling onto my side to absorb the impact. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, waiting for my vision to clear. I was in. I sat up and looked around. The boiler room was dimly lit by the pilot light of the furnace, casting long dancing shadows against the brick walls. It was warm down here. The air was dry and smelled of oil and sawdust. This was my domain, the basement. Upstairs was Lucille's world of lace curtains and porcelain figures. But down here, among the exposed pipes and the wooden beams, this was Langston's world. I stood up, brushing the soot from my clothes. I was in the unfinished section of the basement. Piles of lumber from old projects were stacked against the wall. Jars of nails and screws lined the workbench. I walked softly toward the back wall behind the water heater. To the naked eye, it looked like a solid retaining wall built of cinder blocks. Trey had walked past this wall 1,000 times since he was a child. He used to bounce tennis balls against it. He thought it was just the foundation. But Trey was never curious. He never asked why the basement seemed 5 feet shorter than the floor plan of the house. I reached behind the water heater and found the loose brick I had loosened 30 years ago. I pulled it out. Behind it was a small keypad. Hardwired. Independent of the house's electrical system, powered by a battery backup I changed every year. I punched in the code. 040468. The date Lucille and I bought the house. There was a heavy thunk of a magnetic lock disengaging. I pushed on the cinder block wall. It swung inward on silent, heavy-duty hinges. I stepped inside. The secret room was small, only about 6 feet by 8 feet. It was cool and smelled of paper. I flipped the switch. A single bulb flickered to life overhead. It was exactly as I had left it. My drafting table sat in the center, covered in the blueprints of the bridges I had helped design. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets containing the original deeds, the patent paperwork for my structural reinforcement designs, and the original stock certificates I had bought in the 80s. And in the corner, bolted to the floor, was a titanium floor safe. I fell to my knees in front of it. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from relief. Trey didn't know about this room. Brittany didn't know about this room. They had stripped the furniture upstairs. They had raided my jewelry box. They had taken the car keys. But they hadn't found the heart. I spun the dial. Left to 20, right to 15, left to 72. The handle turned. The heavy door swung open. I looked inside. It was all there. Stacks of cash, bundled in rubber bands, my emergency fund from the consulting gigs I did after retirement. About $50,000, my spare passport, the original deed to the house free and clear, and most importantly, a thick manila envelope labeled Medical Records, Private. I pulled out the envelope. Inside were the results from an independent neurologist I had seen 6 months ago when the fog first started. I had gone behind their backs because I didn't trust the doctor Brittany had taken me to. The report was clear. No signs of Alzheimer's. Cognitive function normal for age. Symptoms suggest external chemical influence. I held the paper in my hand. I had suspected it then, but I had been too afraid to believe it. I didn't want to believe my family was poisoning me, so I had hidden the report thinking I was being paranoid. Now I knew I wasn't paranoid. I was a survivor. I stuffed the cash into my pockets. I put the passport in my sock. I took the medical report and folded it into my jacket. I heard footsteps directly above me. Heavy, frantic footsteps. Trey. He was running around the living room. I could hear his muffled voice shouting, "Where is the deed, Brittany? The buyer wants to see the title history. I can't find the original deed." I looked up at the ceiling of my secret bunker and smiled, a grim, wolfish smile. "You won't find it, son," I whispered, "because you didn't build this house." I did. I stood up. I had the money. I had the proof. I had the weapon. Now I just needed to wait for nightfall. When the house went quiet, I would emerge, not as the confused old man they sent away, but as the landlord coming to collect the rent. And the rent was going to be very, very expensive. I stood in the center of the secret room, breathing in the air that smelled of ozone graphite and silence. This 8 by 6 foot box was the only place on earth that was truly mine. Upstairs, Brittany had put price tags on my furniture. She had thrown my clothes into trash bags. She had scrubbed the scent of my wife's perfume from the curtains. But down here, she could not touch a thing. This room was a time capsule of the man I used to be. The man I still was. I walked over to the drafting table. It was exactly as I had left it 6 months ago before the fog in my brain made me too afraid to come down here. My slide rule was sitting at a 45-degree angle. My mechanical pencils were lined up by lead thickness. A half-finished blueprint of a suspension bridge strut lay spread out, pinned at the corners. I ran my hand over the vellum paper. My hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably in the airport earlier that morning, were steady now. The engineer was back. But I didn't have time for nostalgia. I had a war to fight, and I needed ammunition. I knelt on the cold concrete floor in front of the titanium safe bolted into the foundation. This wasn't a digital safe. I didn't trust electronics. Electronics could be hacked. Electronics could fail. This was a Diebold mechanical tumbler lock taken from a defunct bank branch I had helped demolish in 1992. It required touch. It required patience. I spun the dial. The friction of the tumblers felt like a heartbeat against my fingertips. Left to 20. The year I graduated Howard University. Right to 15. The day of the month Lucille agreed to marry me. Left to 72. The number of piles I drove into the bedrock for the Sears Tower foundation. Click. The heavy steel door swung open with a sigh. I reached inside. The first thing my hand touched was the cool leather of my portfolio. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were the patents, 5 of them, structural dampeners, wind-resistant truss designs. These weren't just papers. They were the reason I had been able to pay for this house. They were the reason Trey had gone to private school. They were the proof that his father was a genius, not a burden. Beneath the patents was the cash. I counted it quickly. $50,000 in non-sequential hundreds wrapped in bank bands. I had started withdrawing this cash 5 years ago when I noticed Trey's gambling habits getting worse. I called it my doomsday fund. I just never thought doomsday would look like my own son. But the most important thing in that safe wasn't the money. It wasn't the patents. It was a blue folder at the bottom of the stack. I pulled it out. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Medical report. Patient Langston Barnes. Date October 14th. I had gone to see Dr. Aris, my old college roommate, who was now a leading neurologist at Northwestern. I had gone to him secretly taking a cab while Trey thought I was napping. I told him I felt like I was losing my mind. I told him I couldn't remember names. I told him the world felt like it was swimming in syrup. He ran every test: MRI, CT scan, blood work, cognitive mapping. I read the conclusion at the bottom of page 3. No evidence of Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia. Cognitive faculties are intact and operating at high efficiency. Blood toxicology screen shows elevated levels of sedative compounds inconsistent with prescribed blood pressure medication. Dr. Aris had told me then. Langston, someone is drugging you. I hadn't wanted to believe him. I couldn't believe him. I told myself it was a mistake. I told myself maybe I accidentally double-dosed my own pills. I buried the report in the safe and tried to forget it. I chose to trust my family over the science, and that choice almost killed me. I shoved the report into the inside pocket of my jacket. This was my shield. This was the proof that would strip Brittany of her power of attorney. This was the paper that would put them in prison. Suddenly the hair on the back of my neck stood up, creak. It was a sound I knew better than the sound of my own voice. The third step from the top of the basement stairs. It had a specific groan, a high-pitched whine of wood rubbing against nail. Someone was coming down. I scrambled to my feet. I looked around the small room. If I closed the safe door, it would make a noise. If I tried to leave through the false wall, I would be exposed in the main boiler room. The footsteps were getting louder, heavier, uneven. It wasn't Brittany. Brittany walked with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. This was a shuffle, a hesitant, dragging walk. Trey. I killed the light switch, plunging the secret room into darkness. But I couldn't stay here. If he noticed the false wall was slightly ajar, he might investigate. I slipped out of the secret room and into the main boiler area. The shadows were deep here, thrown by the pilot light of the furnace. I looked for a place to hide. The lumber pile was too low. The water heater didn't offer enough cover. Then I saw it. The old cedar utility closet against the far wall. It was where I kept my winter gear and chemical solvents. It was tall, narrow, and vented. I moved fast, ignoring the screaming pain in my hip. I opened the door and squeezed inside, pressing myself back against a row of hanging coveralls that smelled of turpentine and oil. I pulled the door shut just as the heavy fire door at the bottom of the stairs swung open. I peered through the wooden slats of the closet door. Trey walked into the boiler room. He looked terrible. He was still wearing my cashmere sweater, but he had spilled wine down the front of it. His face was flushed red and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the chill in the basement. He was holding a flashlight in one hand and the bottle of Margot in the other. He wasn't looking for me. He was hiding. just like he used to hide down here when he broke a vase as a child. He paced back and forth in front of the furnace, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the brick wall. He took a swig from the bottle, almost choking on it. "Stupid," he muttered to himself. "Stupid, stupid, stupid." He kicked a cardboard box, sending it skidding across the floor. "What if he comes back?" he whispered. His voice was trembling. It was the voice of a frightened boy trapped in a man's body. What if the police bring him here? What if he remembers? He stopped pacing and leaned his forehead against the cool metal of the furnace. "I shouldn't have left him," he said. "It's too cold. He doesn't have a coat." Well, he has a coat, but it's not heavy enough. For a split second, I felt a flicker of pity. He was suffering. His conscience was eating him alive. But then Brittany's voice shattered the moment. "Trey." Her voice boomed down the stairs, amplified by the acoustics of the basement. It was sharp, annoyed, and commanding. Trey flinched like a dog that had been kicked. "I'm down here, babe," he yelled back, his voice cracking. Just checking the breaker box." "Checking the breaker box, my ass," Brittany shouted. "Stop drinking that wine and get up here." The buyer just texted. "They want to know if the foundation has any cracks." Trey wiped his mouth. He looked at the ceiling. "Brittany, what if he finds a phone? What if he calls us?" There was a silence. Then I heard the sound of heels clicking on the stairs. She was coming down halfway. "He won't call Trey," she said. Her voice was closer now, colder. "Even if he finds a phone, he doesn't remember the number. He doesn't remember his own social security number." "But he seemed lucid this morning," Trey stammered. "In the car." He looked at me. He looked sharp. Brittany laughed. It was a cruel, dry sound. "That was just a rally," she said. "A final burst of adrenaline. It means nothing." She paused, and her next words drifted down the stairs like poison gas filling the room. "Listen to me, Trey. I made sure of it. That coffee he drank this morning, I put 300 milligrams of Haldol in it, plus the beta blockers. That cocktail would take down a horse, let alone a 70-pound old man with a heart condition." I stopped breathing in the closet. Haldol, it wasn't just sedatives, it was a powerful antipsychotic, used on violent patients in maximum security wards. 300 milligrams was a massive overdose. It could cause cardiac arrest. It could cause permanent brain damage. She hadn't just drugged me to confuse me. She had tried to kill me, or at least turn me into a vegetable so complete that I would never speak again. Trey went silent. He stared at the floor. You gave him that much," he whispered. "I did what was necessary," Brittany snapped. "We needed a clean break. If he is drooling in a wheelchair, the state takes him, no questions asked. Now stop being a coward and get up here. We have to clear out the master bedroom before the stagers arrive." She turned and walked back up the stairs. Trey stood there for a long moment. He looked at the bottle in his hand. "Haldol," he whispered to himself. Jesus. He didn't look horrified. He didn't look like he was going to call 911. He looked relieved. He took another long drink, finishing the bottle. He wiped his mouth. "Okay," he said to the empty room. "Okay. He's gone. It's done." He dropped the empty bottle on the floor. It rolled across the concrete, stopping just inches from the closet where I stood. He turned and walked up the stairs, closing the door behind him. I waited. I counted to 100. Then I pushed the closet door open. I stepped out into the dim light. I looked at the empty wine bottle. My pity was gone. It had evaporated the moment I heard the word Haldol. It had vanished when I saw the relief on my son's face. He knew. He might not have poured the poison, but he was happy to drink the wine bought with my life insurance. I walked over to the secret room and grabbed the stack of cash. I shoved it deep into my pockets. I wasn't just an engineer anymore. I was a demolition expert. They wanted to sell this house. They wanted to sell the foundation. Well, I thought, touching the cold brick wall, let's see how they like it when the floor falls out from under them. I moved toward the stairs. It was time to go back up, but not to reveal myself. Not yet. I had a sample to collect. Brittany said she put the Haldol in the coffee. But I knew Brittany. She was efficient. She wouldn't throw away the rest of the pills. She would keep them, just in case I came back, just in case she needed to finish the job. I needed that bottle, and I knew exactly where she would hide it. I started to climb the stairs one silent step at a time. The ghost of Langston Barnes was coming to haunt the living. I waited until the digital clock on the boiler control panel read 3:13 in the morning. The house above me had settled into a profound silence. a silence that felt heavy and suffocating like a wool blanket soaked in water. For the past 4 hours, I had sat in the dark of my secret room listening to the floorboards creak overhead. I tracked their movements like a submarine operator tracking a destroyer. I heard them arguing in the kitchen. I heard the pop of another cork. I heard the shower run. And finally, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps retreating to the master bedroom, my bedroom, the room where I had slept next to Lucille for 35 years, the room where we had whispered our dreams and comforted each other through our losses. Now it was occupied by a son who wanted me dead and a daughter-in-law who was actively killing me. I stood up. My hip had stiffened in the cold, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins acted as a natural anesthetic. I didn't feel pain anymore. I felt purpose. I checked my pockets. I had the cash. I had the medical report. Now I needed the smoking gun. I needed the poison. I slipped out of the boiler room and approached the basement stairs. They were wooden, steep, and old. Every riser was a potential alarm bell. But I knew this house. I knew that the third step from the bottom warped in the winter and groaned if you stepped in the center. I knew the handrail was loose near the top. I moved like a ghost, placing my feet on the extreme edges of the treads where the wood was supported by the stringers. I reached the kitchen. The moonlight was spilling in through the window I had peered through earlier, casting long blue shadows across the floor. The room smelled of stale wine and takeout food. I saw the empty bottle of Chateau Margaux sitting on the counter next to a greasy pizza box. The sight of it made my stomach clench with hunger, but I ignored it. I wasn't here to eat. I moved into the hallway. The carpet runner muffled my footsteps. I passed the guest room where the door was open, revealing a chaos of boxes. They were packing up my library. My books were thrown into heaps like garbage. First editions of Langston Hughes and James Baldwin treated like recycling. I forced myself to keep moving. I could not save the books tonight. I had to save the author. I reached the door of the master bedroom. It was slightly ajar. Brittany didn't like sleeping with the door closed. She claimed she needed the airflow. It was a habit I used to find annoying, but tonight it was a tactical advantage. I pushed the door open another inch. The hinges were well oiled thanks to my maintenance schedule 3 months ago. I slipped inside. The room was warm, too warm. The thermostat must have been set to 75. It smelled of Brittany's expensive perfume, a cloying floral scent that tried to mask the underlying smell of betrayal. In the center of the room, the king-sized bed looked like a battlefield. Trey was sprawled on his back, his mouth open, snoring with a wet, rattling sound. He looked like a child who had exhausted himself throwing a tantrum. Brittany was on her side facing the window, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. I stood at the foot of the bed watching them. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even hate. It was a profound, icy detachment. I was looking at two strangers who had broken into my home. The biological connection I had with the man in that bed had been severed the moment he left me at the airport terminal. I scanned the room. I needed to find her purse. Brittany lived out of her bag. It was her command center. If she had the pills, they would be in there close to her money and her phone. I saw it. Her orange Hermes Birkin bag, the one she claimed was a knockoff, but I knew cost $12,000 of my money, sitting on the velvet armchair by the window. I moved toward it. The floorboards here were covered by a thick rug, so I moved faster. I reached the chair and peered inside the bag. It was a mess. Lipstick tubes, receipts, crumpled tissues. I reached in my hand, gloved in thin latex I had taken from the utility closet. I moved aside a wallet thick with credit cards. I pushed past a set of keys. My fingers brushed against plastic. I pulled it out. It was a white plastic bottle. The label featured a smiling cartoon sun and the words "Nature's Best Senior Vitality, Daily Multivitamin." It looked innocent. It looked like love. I unscrewed the cap. Inside were dozens of blue oblong pills. They looked exactly like the one I had in my pocket, the one I had spit out. But they didn't smell like vitamins. Vitamins have a distinct earthy yeast-like smell. These smelled like nothing, just chemical chalk. I needed to be sure. I couldn't take the whole bottle. If she woke up and found it missing, she would panic. She would know I had returned. She might destroy other evidence or worse, flee before I could close the trap. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small plastic Ziploc bag I had found in the kitchen drawer used for storing loose screws. I poured about 10 pills into the bag. It was enough for a toxicology screen, but not enough to be visually noticeable in the nearly full bottle. I screwed the cap back on. Click. The sound was soft, but in the silent room it sounded like a gunshot. On the bed, Brittany stirred. I froze. The rustle of sheets was deafening. Brittany rolled over. She let out a small moan and shifted her weight. Then she sat up. I was standing directly between the window and the bed. The moonlight was behind me. To her, I was just a silhouette, a dark shape against the silver light. I stopped breathing. I stopped my heart. I became a statue. I became a coat rack. I became a shadow. Brittany rubbed her eyes. She looked straight at me. "Trey," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Trey, did you leave the closet open?" She was looking right at me, but her brain wasn't processing it. She was seeing a shape where she expected to see furniture. She was half asleep, drugged by her own exhaustion and the arrogance that told her I was miles away rotting in a state facility. I didn't move a muscle. My hip was screaming, a burning needle of fire driving into the joint. My lungs were burning for air, but I held it. I held it with the discipline of a man who had once stood perfectly still on a girder 40 stories up while a gust of wind tried to blow him off. "Trey," she said again, louder this time. Trey snorted in his sleep and rolled over, turning his back to her. "Ugh, useless," she hissed. She stared at me for one more second, a second that lasted a decade, a second where I could see the gears turning in her mind, trying to decide if the shadow was a man or a trick of the light. Then she flopped back down onto the pillow. She pulled the duvet up over her head. "Close the damn door," she muttered into the mattress. "It's freezing." I waited. I counted 10 breaths. Her breathing evened out. She was back under. I exhaled slowly, letting the air escape through my nose in a silent stream. My legs were shaking now. That was too close. That was reckless. I put the Ziploc bag with the pills into my inside jacket pocket right next to the medical report. I put the vitamin bottle back in her purse exactly the way I found it, nestled between the wallet and the keys. I backed away toward the door. I didn't turn my back on them. I watched them until I was out in the hallway. I pulled the bedroom door shut, leaving it exactly as ajar as it had been. I walked back down the hallway, past the boxes of my books, past the photos of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me in the dark. I made it to the kitchen. I didn't stop. I went straight to the basement door. I descended the stairs, my legs feeling like jelly now that the adrenaline was fading. I crawled back into the boiler room, back through the secret door, and collapsed into the chair in my hidden sanctuary. I pulled out the bag of pills. I held them up to the light of the single bulb. 10 little blue soldiers. To Brittany, they were a tool to erase an old man, to erase a nuisance. But to me, they were the final nail in the coffin. Not my coffin, hers. I looked at my watch. It was 4 a.m. The lab opened at 8. My friend Dr. Eris would be there. I had 4 hours to wait, 4 hours to sit in the dark and think about the fact that the woman sleeping upstairs had looked me in the eye every morning, smiled, and handed me death in a plastic cup. And my son who lay beside her snoring while she did it. I put the pills away. I wasn't an old man anymore. I wasn't a father anymore. I was the prosecution, and the trial was about to begin. I watched from the crack in the blinds of the second-floor guest room as my son Trey and his wife Brittany walked out of my front door. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. The sky was a flat slate gray, threatening snow again, but they were dressed as if they were going to a funeral. Trey wore a black suit that was tight around the shoulders, and Brittany wore a charcoal dress coat with a silk scarf tied severely around her neck. They looked somber. They looked grieving. To the neighbors watching from their windows, they looked like a distraught couple heading out to search for their missing father. But I knew where they were going. I had heard them discussing it over coffee while I hid in the basement vents. They were going to the offices of Sterling and Holt, a law firm downtown that specialized in estate management. They were going to file an affidavit of disappearance. They were going to tell a lawyer that Langston Barnes, a senile old man with a history of wandering, had vanished at O'Hare Airport. They would start the clock on declaring me legally incompetent so they could access my accounts without my signature. I waited until their Range Rover pulled away from the curb and disappeared down King Drive. I counted to 60 just to be sure they hadn't forgotten something. Then I moved. I didn't leave through the front door. The biometric lock was still active, and I didn't want to trigger any alerts on their phones. I went to the back door off the kitchen. It was bolted from the inside. I slid the deadbolt back, my hand gloved in latex. I opened the door and stepped out into the biting wind. The hawk, as we call it in Chicago, was out in full force today, whipping off the lake with a cruelty that could freeze your tears before they hit your cheek. I pulled my wool collar up and walked down the alley. I didn't look like a rich engineer anymore. I looked like an old man trying to outrun a storm. I walked 3 blocks south to a payphone outside a liquor store. I didn't want to use a cell phone that could be tracked. I dialed a number I had memorized 40 years ago. "Eris," I said when the line clicked open. "I am coming in. Clear the schedule." Dr. Marcus Eris was not just a toxicologist. He was my brother in everything but blood. We had marched together in Selma in '65. We had roomed together at Howard. While I was learning how to build structures that wouldn't fall down, Marcus was learning how the human body could be broken and put back together. He ran a private diagnostic lab on the South Side, a place that served the community when the big hospitals turned their backs. I caught a gypsy cab on 47th Street. The driver didn't ask questions when I handed him a $50 bill from my stash. I sat in the back watching the city roll by. The storefront churches, the boarded-up windows, the new condos rising like glass towers among the brick ruins. I felt like a ghost haunting my own city. Everyone thought I was gone. Everyone thought I was confused. When I arrived at the lab, Marcus was waiting at the back entrance. He was a small man with skin the color of polished mahogany and hair like white cotton wool. He looked at me at my cane at the dark circles under my eyes, and he didn't say a word. He just opened the door and pulled me into the warmth of the hallway that smelled of antiseptic and peppermint tea. We went into his private office. It was a cluttered room filled with books, microscopes, and framed degrees. I sat down heavily in a leather chair that groaned under my weight. My hip was throbbing, a reminder that I was 72 years old and sleeping on concrete floors. "You look like hell," Langston Marcus said, handing me a steaming mug of tea. "I thought you were in Italy. Trey posted on Facebook that you guys were flying out yesterday." I took a sip of the tea. It burned my tongue and I welcomed the pain. "I never made it to the plane, Marcus," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Ziploc bag containing the 10 blue pills. I placed it on the desk between us. The pills looked innocent enough, just small blue ovals. "They told me these were vitamins." I said, my voice steady. "Brittany said they were for my memory. She said I have early onset Alzheimer's, Marcus. She said I was forgetting things. She said I was becoming aggressive." Marcus picked up the bag. He held it up to the light, adjusting his spectacles. "And are you," I asked, "forgetting things?" I looked him in the eye. "Yesterday I couldn't remember my social security number," I said. "The day before that, I got lost in my own hallway. My hands shake, Marcus. My heart races like I just ran a marathon when all I did was stand up. I felt like I was drowning in fog." "But today," Marcus asked. "Today I didn't take the pill," I said. "And today I broke into my own house, cracked a safe I hadn't touched in 10 years, and remembered your phone number from 1982. Marcus nodded slowly. He stood up and walked over to his mass spectrometer. It was a complex machine, a beast of science that didn't lie. "Let's see what Brittany has been feeding you," he said. He crushed one of the pills into a fine powder. He mixed it with a solvent. He injected the sample into the machine. We waited in silence. The machine hummed and whirred. The sound was hypnotic. I stared at the wall at a picture of us graduating in 1974, young and full of fire. I wondered where that Langston had gone. I wondered how he had raised a son who would do this. The printer spat out a graph. Marcus tore it off. He stared at it for a long time. His face hardened. The lines around his mouth deepened. He turned to me. He didn't look like a doctor anymore. He looked like a judge, passing a sentence. "Langston," he said quietly, "do you know what haloperidol is?" "Haldol," I asked. "The antipsychotic." "Yes," Marcus said. "But this isn't just Haldol. This is a custom compound. It contains haloperidol at a dosage of 20 milligrams per pill." 20, I whispered. "I know enough about medicine to know that 5 milligrams is a standard dose for agitation." 20, Marcus repeated. "And she was giving you this daily. But that's not all. It is mixed with scopolamine." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Scopolamine. Devil's breath. It blocks memory formation. It makes people compliant. It turns free will into slush. "And there is one more thing," Marcus said, pointing to a spike on the graph. "Digoxin." "Digoxin?" I asked. "That's heart medication," it is, Marcus said. But you don't have a heart condition, Langston. Your heart is strong. Giving digoxin to a man with a healthy heart, it causes arrhythmias, confusion, fatigue. And if the levels get high enough, it stops. I finished the sentence for him. Marcus nodded grimly. It looks like a heart attack, a natural, tragic heart attack in an elderly man who was already suffering from decline. No autopsy would flag it unless they were looking for it. I sat back in the chair. The room seemed to tilt. They weren't just drugging me to steal my money. They were killing me. Brittany wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was an assassin. And Trey, my son, he watched me swallow those pills every morning. He watched his father die by inches, and he poured the coffee to wash it down. I closed my eyes. I thought I would cry. I thought I would scream, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a coldness settle over me. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. It was colder than the Chicago wind outside. It was the coldness of absolute zero. The Langston Barnes who bounced Trey on his knee died in that chair. The Langston Barnes who paid for Brittany's student loans died in that chair. I opened my eyes. Marcus was watching me concerned. "I am not sick, Marcus," I said softly. "No," Marcus replied. "You are being poisoned." I stood up. The pain in my hip was gone. Or maybe I just didn't care about it anymore. "Can you write an official toxicology report?" I asked. "I can," Marcus said. "It will hold up in court. It will hold up anywhere. But Langston, we need to call the police. This is attempted murder. We can have them arrested by lunch." I walked over to the window and looked out at the gray street. I saw a police cruiser drive by. "No," I said. Marcus frowned. "What do you mean, no? They are trying to kill you." "If I call the police now," I said, turning back to him, "they go to jail. Brittany gets a lawyer. She claims it was an accident. She claims she mixed up the bottles. Maybe she gets 5 years. Maybe she gets off. And Trey plays the victim." I picked up the Ziploc bag of pills and put it back in my pocket. "I don't want them in jail, Marcus. Not yet. Jail is too safe. Jail is a roof over their heads and 3 meals a day." "Then what do you want?" Marcus asked. "I want to dismantle them," I said. I buttoned my coat. "Brittany thinks I am a vegetable. She thinks I am a structural liability that she has finally removed. She forgot that I am the one who designed the foundation she is standing on." I walked to the door. "I am going to take it all, Marcus. The money, the reputation, the future. I am going to leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of the mistake they made today." Langston, Marcus warned. "Be careful. These people are desperate." I smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "They should be desperate," I said. "They just declared war on a man who has nothing left to lose." I walked out of the lab and back into the cold. The wind hit my face, but I didn't flinch. I had a bank to visit, and I had a son to destroy. The First National Bank of Chicago building on Madison Street is a fortress of limestone and granite that I know intimately. In 1982, I was the lead structural consultant when they retrofitted the main vault in the basement. I spent 6 months calculating the load-bearing capacity of the floor to ensure it could hold the weight of 50 tons of steel and gold. I knew every bolt, every weld, and every camera angle in that lobby. It was a place built on trust and stability. But as I stood across the street, huddled in the doorway of a coffee shop watching the revolving doors spin, I knew that trust was being violated inside. I checked my watch. It was 11:15. The banks had been open for 2 hours. If Brittany was efficient, and she was nothing if not efficient, she would have sent Trey here immediately after they left the lawyer's office. They needed cash. They needed to pay off the stagers, the movers, and the travel agents for their victory lap to Italy. I pulled my hat lower and wrapped my scarf around my face. I didn't look like the distinguished engineer who used to bank here. I looked like a shadow. I waited for a large group of office workers to exit the building, and I slipped into the slipstream, moving through the revolving door with my head down. The lobby was warm, smelling of polished marble and money. The air was hushed the way libraries and cathedrals are hushed. I moved to the far side of the room, taking a seat behind a large potted fern near the loan officers' desks. From this vantage point, I had a clear line of sight to the teller windows and the glass-walled offices of the senior management. And there he was. Trey was sitting at the desk of the senior account manager, a woman named Mrs. Higgins, whom I had known for years. He was wearing his black funeral suit, but he looked like he was melting inside it. His leg was bouncing nervously under the table, a rapid staccato rhythm that shook the entire chair. He kept wiping his palms on his trousers. He held a thick stack of papers in his hand. The fraudulent power of attorney, the affidavit of disappearance, the lies Brittany had printed out on high-quality bond paper. I watched him push the papers across the desk toward Mrs. Higgins. He was talking fast. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the cadence. It was the sales pitch of a desperate man. He was probably telling her about his poor father, the tragic incident at the airport, the urgent need to secure the funds for medical expenses. Mrs. Higgins looked concerned. She put on her reading glasses and picked up the documents. She began to read. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Mrs. Higgins was a good woman, but she was bureaucratic. If the papers looked right, she would process them. She had no reason to doubt the grieving son of a long-time client. Trey looked around the room, his eyes darting nervously. He wasn't looking for me. He thought I was dead or institutionalized. He was looking for ghosts. He was looking for the consequences of his gambling debts. He was terrified that his credit cards would be declined or that someone would ask for a verification code he couldn't provide. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone I had bought at the airport newsstand. I didn't call the main line. I didn't call Mrs. Higgins. I dialed the private cell number of Samuel Henderson, the branch president. Samuel and I went back 40 years. We played chess on Tuesdays. We argued about politics on Fridays. I had designed the extension on his house in Hyde Park for free because that is what friends do. The phone rang twice. "Hello, this is Henderson." "Samuel," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Don't say my name. Don't look around. Just listen." There was a pause on the line. I could hear the confusion in his breath. "Langston, is that you?" we heard. "Trey called this morning. He said you were missing. He said the police were looking for you." "Do I sound missing, Samuel?" I asked. "Do I sound confused?" "No. You sound angry. I am not missing Samuel. I am watching my son try to rob me in your lobby." "What?" Samuel whispered. "I am sitting behind the fern near the elevator," I said. "Trey is at Mrs. Higgins's desk. He has a forged power of attorney. He is trying to liquidate the retirement accounts. All of it. $500,000. "Good Lord," Samuel breathed. "I see him. I see Mrs. Higgins typing. Langston, should I call security? Should I call the police?" "No," I said quickly. "If you call the police, it becomes a scene. Trey will lawyer up. He will claim he is acting in my best interest. It will get tied up in court for months, and while the lawyers fight, Brittany will find another way to bleed me dry." "Then what do you want me to do?" Samuel asked. "I want you to scare him," I said. "I want you to terrify him so badly that he runs out of this building and never comes back." "How?" I took a deep breath. I knew Trey's weakness. Brittany was motivated by greed, but Trey was motivated by fear. He had secrets I had only begun to uncover. The gambling, the debts, the offshore sites. "Tell him the account is frozen," I said. "But not because of me. Tell him it is frozen because of a federal investigation. Tell him the system flagged the account for money laundering and structuring. Mention the FBI. Mention the RICO Act." "Money laundering?" Samuel asked. "But your accounts are clean." "Trey's conscience isn't," I said. "He has been moving money around for his gambling. If he hears the words money laundering, he won't think about me. He will think about his bookies. He will think about the shell companies he and Brittany set up. He will panic." I saw Samuel stand up in his glass office on the mezzanine level. He straightened his tie. "Consider it done, old friend," Samuel said. "I never liked that boy. He has weak eyes." I watched Samuel walk out of his office. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of authority. He walked down the marble stairs and approached Mrs. Higgins's desk. I saw Mrs. Higgins look up, relieved to see her boss. She handed him the paperwork. Samuel took the papers. He didn't look at them. He looked at Trey. From my hiding spot, I saw Trey freeze. He stopped bouncing his leg. He sat up straighter, trying to project confidence, but looking like a child caught with his hand in the jar. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could read the body language perfectly. Samuel placed his hands on the desk, leaning in close. He spoke softly. Trey's face went from pale to chalk white in 3 seconds. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the papers, then at Samuel, then at the security guard standing by the door. Samuel pointed a finger at the computer screen. He gestured to the ceiling as if referencing a higher power or perhaps a federal satellite. Trey stood up. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward and crashed onto the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. People in the lobby turned to look. Trey didn't pick up the chair. He didn't pick up the papers. He backed away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was shaking his head violently. Samuel crossed his arms and stood his ground, a silent sentinel guarding the vault. Trey turned and ran. He didn't walk. He didn't jog. He sprinted. He ran toward the revolving doors, slipping on the polished floor, scrambling to regain his footing. He looked like a man who felt the hot breath of the law on his neck. He pushed through the doors and burst out onto the street, disappearing into the lunchtime crowd. I sat there behind the fern and let out a long breath. My son. The boy I had raised to be honest. The boy I had taught to stand tall. He was running like a rat from a sinking ship, terrified not because he had hurt his father, but because he thought he had been caught in his own web of crimes. He didn't know I was there. He didn't know I was the one pulling the strings. He thought it was the universe punishing him. Samuel watched him go, then turned and looked toward the fern. He didn't wave. He just nodded once, a subtle dip of his chin. Then he picked up the fraudulent papers, tore them in half, and dropped them into the shredder bin behind the desk. My money was safe. But as I stood up and adjusted my scarf, I felt no joy. I had saved my fortune, but I had confirmed my bankruptcy as a father. Trey hadn't even tried to argue. He hadn't fought for me. He had fought only for his own skin. I walked out of the bank using the side exit to avoid being seen. The wind outside felt colder than before. Phase 1 was complete. I had cut off their supply lines. Now they would be desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I hailed a taxi. Where to, the driver asked. Go to the lake, I said. I need to think. But I didn't need to think. I knew exactly where I was going next. Brittany was hosting an open house this weekend. She wanted to sell my home to the highest bidder. She wanted to invite strangers into my sanctuary. Well, I thought as the taxi merged into traffic, I think I will accept the invitation. I reached into my pocket and touched the cash I had taken from the safe. I needed a new suit. Something sharp, something intimidating, something that said I was a man who bought buildings, not a man who lived in them. Trey was running, but Brittany would be digging in. She would be furious that the money transfer failed. She would double down. I leaned back in the seat and watched the city pass by. You want to sell my house, Brittany? I whispered to the cold window. Fine, but you better be ready for the inspection, because I find cracks in everything. The weekend arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron. It was the perfect backdrop for what I was about to do. For the past 3 days, I had lived in the shadows, moving between cheap motels and the library, staying off the grid while my son and his wife dismantled my life. But today, I was stepping back into the light. Not as Langston Barnes, the confused old man who got lost at the airport, but as Mr. Black, a wealthy real estate investor from New York with a sharp eye for structural defects. I stood in the bathroom of the motel and looked in the mirror. The face staring back at me was familiar but changed. I had shaved off the gray beard I had worn for 20 years, exposing a jawline that was still strong. I had dyed my white hair a steel gray. I put on the suit I had bought with the cash from the safe. It was an Italian-cut charcoal wool tailored to fit a man who commands rooms, not a man who shuffles through them. I put on a pair of heavy, tortoiseshell glasses with tinted lenses. I looked like a shark. Waiting for me in the parking lot was Sarah. Sarah was the daughter of my old foreman, a brilliant young woman who had put herself through law school while working 2 jobs. She owed me a favor for a letter of recommendation I wrote 10 years ago, but she was here because she hated injustice. She wore a power suit that could cut glass and carried a briefcase that looked like it contained nuclear codes. Ready to go shopping, Mr. Black, she asked as I climbed into her sedan. I adjusted my cufflinks. The gold felt cold against my wrist. Let's go inspect the merchandise, I said. We pulled up to my house at 1 in the afternoon. The street was lined with cars. Brittany had done her job well. There were balloons tied to the gate. A massive sign on the lawn read, "Open House. Rare opportunity, priced to sell." It made my stomach turn. She was selling my sanctuary like it was a used car. We walked up the steps. I didn't use my cane today. I forced my body to remember the posture of my youth. I walked with a rhythmic, purposeful stride, ignoring the fire in my hip. The front door was open. The smell of fresh baked cookies wafted out. It was the oldest trick in the realtor handbook. Mask the smell of betrayal with sugar and vanilla. We stepped inside. The house was crowded. There were young couples holding hands, looking at the crown molding with dreamy eyes. There were serious-looking men in suits tapping on the walls. And in the center of it all, holding court like a queen, was Brittany. She looked radiant. She was wearing a white dress that shouted innocence and holding a glass of sparkling water. She was laughing, touching the arm of a potential buyer, projecting the image of a woman who had not a care in the world. She had no idea that the man she had poisoned was standing 10 feet away. I walked past her. She glanced at me, smiling that practiced realtor smile, but her eyes slid right over me. She saw the suit. She saw the expensive watch. She saw a wallet, not a father-in-law. To her, Langston Barnes was a frail, bearded creature in a cardigan. This imposing man in charcoal wool didn't register in her predator's brain. I moved into the living room. Sarah stayed close, playing the role of my attorney perfectly. I listened to Brittany's pitch. This house is a gem, she was telling a young couple. Fully renovated in 2010. The foundation is solid rock. The previous owner was a very meticulous man. He kept everything in perfect condition. I almost laughed. She was using my reputation to sell the house she stole from me. I walked up to the young couple. They looked nice. They looked like they had saved for years for a down payment. I couldn't let them buy this crime scene. "Excuse me," I said. My voice pitched an octave lower than usual, gravelly and authoritative. I couldn't help but overhear. Did she say the foundation was solid? The young man looked at me. Yes. Why I took off my glasses and peered at the floorboards near the bay window. I tapped the wood with the toe of my Italian loafer. I wouldn't be so sure, I said loud enough for the people nearby to hear. Do you feel that vibration when a truck passes outside? The couple frowned. I didn't feel anything the woman said. I nodded wisely. That is the problem. You don't feel it until the sheer stress snaps the joists. I am a structural engineer by trade. Look at the slope of this floor. It has a 2-degree list to the south. That indicates subsidence in the sub-basement. The young man looked alarmed. He looked at the floor. Is that bad? It is catastrophic, I said, keeping a straight face. Fixing a subsidence issue on a gray stone of this vintage, you are looking at $200,000 in underpinning work, minimum, and that is assuming the city doesn't condemn the property first. The woman's eyes went wide. 200,000. I shook my head sadly. It is a shame. Beautiful molding, but a house without legs is just a pile of expensive bricks. If I were you, I would ask for the geotechnical report, if they don't have one run. I walked away, leaving them whispering frantically to each other. I saw them grab their coats and head for the door, giving Brittany a wide berth. One down. I moved to the dining room. A man in a tan suit was inspecting the chandelier. He looked like an investor, a flipper. These were the dangerous ones. They didn't care about structural issues, they cared about margins. I signaled Sarah. She stepped in. "Mr. Black," she said loudly, checking her phone. "My firm just pulled the title history on this property. It is complicated." The investor looked up. Complicated how Sarah lowered her voice just enough to make him lean in. "There is a lis pendens filing," she lied smoothly. "A dispute regarding the mental capacity of the previous owner at the time of transfer. If you buy this, you might be buying a lawsuit from the estate. It could be tied up in probate court for years." The investor narrowed his eyes. The agent said it was a clean title. Urgent sale. Urgent usually means desperate, Sarah said, closing her file. And desperate usually means hidden liabilities. We are passing on this one. Too much risk. The investor nodded slowly. "Thanks for the tip." He put down the brochure and walked out. I made my way through the house, poisoning the well one drop at a time. I pointed out imaginary mold in the vents. I talked about the outdated knob and tube wiring behind the plaster. I mentioned a non-existent zoning change that would lower property values. Within 30 minutes, the crowd had thinned. The excited buzz of buyers had turned into the hushed murmurs of concerned citizens. Brittany noticed. I saw her scanning the room, her smile faltering. She saw people leaving without taking applications. She saw the investor drive away. She sensed the shift in the atmosphere. She locked eyes with me. She saw me standing in the center of the living room, tapping the wall with a critical expression. She marched over. Her heels clicked aggressively on the hardwood. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice tight. "Can I help you?" "You seem to have a lot of opinions about my listing." I turned to face her. Up close, I could see the stress lines around her eyes. I could see the tremor in her hand holding the clipboard. "Just doing my due diligence, ma'am," I said. "I represent a consortium of investors. We are looking for properties with integrity." "This house has integrity," Brittany snapped. "My father-in-law lived here for 40 years. He was an engineer. He maintained this place impeccably." I looked around the room. "And where is he now?" I asked. "This impeccable engineer." Brittany flinched. It was a microscopic reaction, a tightening of the jaw, but I saw it. He passed away," she lied. Suddenly, "That is why we are selling. It is too painful for the family to keep it." I nodded slowly. Painful indeed. But if he was such a good engineer, why did he leave the load-bearing beam in the basement, unreinforced? Brittany blinked. I walked over to the wall that hid the secret staircase to the basement. I placed my hand on the plaster. "I felt a vibration here," I said. "A resonance. It suggests the central support column has been compromised. Have you heard any settling noises?" "Creaking at night. Sounds like footsteps coming from below." Brittany went pale. She took a half step back. I don't know what you are talking about," she stammered. "The inspection was clean." "Inspections miss things," I said, leaning in closer. "Secrets have a way of burying themselves in the foundation, ma'am. And when they come out, they bring the whole house down." She stared at me. For a second, I thought she recognized me. I thought she saw past the dyed hair and the glasses. I saw fear in her eyes, not fear of a buyer, but fear of the truth. But then she shook her head. She was too arrogant to believe I could be this man. "If you are not interested in making an offer, sir," she said, her voice icy, "I am going to have to ask you to leave. You are disturbing the serious buyers." I looked around at the empty room. "I don't see any serious buyers, ma'am," I said. "I just see a house that smells like trouble," I signaled Sarah. "Come along, counselor," I said. "I think we have seen enough. This structure is unsound." We walked toward the door. "Wait!" Brittany called out. Her desperation broke through. I stopped and turned back. "Look," she said, lowering her voice. "If it is about the price, we can negotiate. The family needs a quick close. Cash offers get a significant discount." I looked at her. She was begging. She was selling my life at a discount because she was terrified the money would run out. "How much of a discount?" I asked. 20%, she whispered. "If you can close by Friday." I smiled. "I will think about it," I said. "But frankly, ma'am, I don't think you have the authority to sell this house." "What does that mean?" she demanded. "I have the power of attorney." "Paper is flammable, ma'am," I said. "Iron is not." I turned and walked out the door. We walked down the steps past the for sale sign. Sarah opened the car door for me. "That was brutal," she said as we pulled away. I almost felt sorry for her. "Don't," I said, watching the house disappear in the rearview mirror. "She just tried to sell a $2 million home for scrap because she wants a vacation." I took off my glasses. My eyes were tired but clear. "Did you get the names?" I asked. Sarah patted her briefcase. "Every single buyer who signed the guest list. I will contact them Monday morning and inform them that the title is in dispute. No one will touch that house with a 10-foot pole." "Good," I said. We drove in silence for a while. The sky was getting darker. Snow was starting to fall again. "Where to now?" Sarah asked. "Drop me at the precinct," I said. "The precinct." "You said you weren't going to the police yet." "I am not going to report a crime," I said. "I am going to report a theft." "A theft?" "Yes," I said, touching the empty spot on my wrist where my watch used to be. "I need to file a report for a stolen Cadillac." Sarah looked at me confused. "But your Cadillac is in the garage. Trey hasn't moved it." "He will," I said. "He is desperate. Brittany just lost her buyers. She is going to pressure him to sell the only liquid asset left." I looked out the window. "Tonight Trey is going to try to sell my car. And tonight he is going to learn that a getaway car doesn't work if the owner still has the keys. Step on it, Sarah. The open house is closed, but the demolition is just beginning." The alley behind my house was darker than the street. It was a narrow canyon of brick and asphalt lined with overflowing garbage cans and the skeletons of old bicycles chained to fences. I sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's sedan parked 3 houses down, the engine off the heater slowly dying. The cold seeped in through the glass, but I did not shiver. My eyes were fixed on the detached garage at the end of my property. It was 8 o'clock at night. The open house had been a disaster thanks to my performance as the structural engineer from hell. Brittany was inside the house, likely screaming into her pillow or frantically calling another realtor. But Trey was not inside. Trey was in the garage. I knew he would be here. When a rat is cornered, it does not fight. It tries to scurry out the back door with whatever crumbs it can carry. The garage door rumbled open. The automatic light flickered on, illuminating the dusty concrete floor and the shape that slept beneath a heavy canvas tarp. Trey walked in. He was joined by a man I did not recognize. A short, squat man wearing a greasy mechanic's jumpsuit and chewing on a toothpick. He drove a flatbed tow truck that was idling in the alley, its diesel engine chugging like a sick animal. "This is the guy," Trey said, his voice echoing in the cold air. Trey grabbed the corner of the canvas tarp and yanked it off. My heart slammed against my ribs. There she was, my 1968 Cadillac DeVille, candy apple red with a white convertible top and white wall tires. I bought that car the year Lucille told me she was pregnant with Trey. It was the first thing I ever bought that wasn't practical. It wasn't for getting to work. It wasn't for hauling lumber. It was for Sunday drives down Lakeshore Drive with the top down and the radio playing Motown. It was for joy. Lucille loved that car. She named her Bessie. She used to polish the chrome bumpers until she could apply her lipstick in the reflection. And now my son was standing there kicking the front tire with his designer boot. "There she is," Trey said, spitting on the floor. "A 1968 rust bucket." The mechanic walked around the car, running a dirty hand along the fender. I felt a surge of rage so pure it almost blinded me. That man was touching Lucille's memory with hands covered in grease. Body looked straight. The mechanic grunted. Interior Trey opened the door. The white leather was pristine. I conditioned it twice a year. "It smells like old people," Trey said, wrinkling his nose. "It smells like mothballs and dead dreams. Just take it. How much you want for it?" the mechanic asked, kicking the bumper. Trey looked over his shoulder at the house. He was nervous. He needed cash, and he needed it before Brittany found out he was selling the only asset she hadn't claimed yet. "Give me $5,000, Trey said. "Cash. Right now." The mechanic laughed. $5,000. For this boat. The transmission is probably shot. The seals are probably dry rot. I'm doing you a favor hauling it away. I'll give you $2,000. Scrap value. $2,000. My stomach turned. That car was worth $40,000 to a collector. To me it was priceless, and he was selling it for the price of a used laptop. "Fine," Trey snapped. $2,000. Just get it out of here. It's taking up space. I want to turn this garage into a home gym anyway. He looked at the car with genuine hatred. "My dad loved this stupid thing," Trey said. "He cared more about this car than he did about my tuition. He spent every Sunday waxing it while I was inside watching TV. It's a coffin on wheels. Good riddance." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. Sarah looked at me. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel. "Are you going to go stop him?" she asked. "No," I said, dialing a number. "I am not going to stop him. The Chicago Police Department is going to stop him." I didn't dial 911. I dialed the direct line to the district desk sergeant, a number I had saved during the open house preparation. "Dispatcher, this is a priority call," I said, my voice changing into the clipped, anxious tone of a concerned neighbor. "I am reporting a grand theft auto in progress in the alley behind 4512 King Drive." I watched the mechanic lower the ramp of the flatbed truck. The winch cable hissed as he pulled it out. "Description of the vehicle," the dispatcher asked. 1968 Cadillac DeVille," I said, reciting the details from the depths of my engineer's memory. "Color red, convertible, license plate number LUCILLE. And sir, how do you know it is being stolen?" "Because I checked the VIN registry," I lied smoothly. "And I see 2 men loading it onto a truck with no plates. The owner is an elderly man named Langston Barnes. He is not currently at the residence. These men are stripping the garage." I hung up. I watched as the mechanic hooked the winch chain onto the undercarriage of my car. The sound of metal on metal made me wince. He started the motor. The cable tightened. The Cadillac groaned as it began to roll forward inches at a time toward the ramp. "Stop," I whispered to the glass. "Stop right there, Bessie. Don't you move for him." Trey was standing by the truck, rubbing his hands together, waiting for the cash. He looked at his watch. He looked down the alley. Then the alley exploded with blue light. A squad car turned the corner silently, its lights flashing, bouncing off the brick walls, and illuminating the snow like a disco floor. It accelerated quickly, pulling up right behind the tow truck, blocking it in. The siren chirped once. Whoop, whoop! Trey jumped a foot in the air. The mechanic froze his hand on the winch lever. 2 officers stepped out. One was a young rookie, the other was a veteran with a thick mustache. They walked up the alley, hands resting near their holsters. "Step away from the vehicle," the veteran officer commanded. Trey put his hands up immediately. His face went from flushed to pale in a heartbeat. "Officers," he stammered. "It's okay. It's okay. This is my car. I live here." The mechanic didn't say anything. He just unhooked the chain and stepped back, looking at the ground. He knew the drill. He wasn't going to take the fall for a rich kid. "Is that so?" the officer asked, shining his flashlight into Trey's eyes. "We got a call about a stolen vehicle. High-value classic. Stolen." Trey laughed nervously. No. It belongs to my father, Langston Barnes." "And where is Mr. Barnes?" the officer asked, looking around the garage. He is away," Trey said. "He is ill. I am handling his affairs. I have the authority to sell this vehicle." The officer looked at the car, then back at Trey. "Okay, sir. If you are handling his affairs, then you have the title right and the power of attorney authorizing the sale of assets." Trey froze. I sat in the car down the street and smiled. The title. The original pink slip from 1968, signed by the dealer and countersigned by me. It was in the titanium safe in the basement, the safe Trey didn't know existed. I don't have it on me," Trey stuttered. "It's in the house, in the safe. I can go get it." The officer shook his head. "Sir, you are selling a vehicle without a title to an unlicensed hauler in an alley at 8 p.m. That doesn't look like estate management. That looks like fencing stolen goods." "It's not stolen," Trey shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's my inheritance. My dad is gone. He's practically dead." "Practically dead isn't dead," the officer said, stepping closer. "And until he is dead or you have a court order signed by a judge, this car belongs to Langston Barnes. And unless Langston Barnes walks out here and tells me to let you take it, this car stays exactly where it is." The mechanic spat his toothpick onto the ground. "I'm out," he grumbled. He walked to his truck. "Wait!" Trey yelled, grabbing the mechanic's arm. "Don't go. We had a deal, 2,000. "Get off me, kid!" the mechanic growled, pushing Trey back. "I don't do cops. You said it was clean." The mechanic jumped into his cab, threw the truck into reverse, and backed down the alley, maneuvering around the squad car with practiced ease. He disappeared into the night, leaving Trey standing alone in the exhaust fumes. The officer turned to Trey. "Move the car back into the garage, sir. Now." "But," Trey whined. "Now," the officer barked. "And if I get another call about this car moving, I am booking you for attempted grand larceny. Do you understand?" "Yes," Trey whispered. He got into the car. He tried to start it. The engine cranked, ruh, but it didn't catch. I chuckled softly. I had disconnected the distributor cap wire 3 days ago before I left for the airport. Just a precaution. An engineer always has a backup plan. "It won't start," Trey yelled, hitting the steering wheel. "It's a piece of junk." "Push it," the officer said, crossing his arms. I watched my son in his Italian boots and his cashmere sweater put his shoulder against the heavy steel bumper of the Cadillac. I watched him grunt and strain, trying to push 4,000 pounds of American steel back up the slight incline of the garage floor. His feet slipped in the slush. He fell to his knees, ruining his trousers. He got up cursing, kicking the ground, and pushed again. It took him 10 minutes. 10 minutes of humiliation while the police watched. Finally, the car rolled back into the darkness. "Close the door," the officer ordered. Trey hit the button. The garage door rumbled down, sealing Bessie back in her tomb. The police got back in their car and drove away, leaving the alley silent again. Trey stood there in the snow. His clothes ruined, his deal, broken, his pockets empty. He kicked a garbage can, sending it crashing over spilling trash into the alley. "I hate you," he screamed at the closed garage door. "I hate you, Dad. Why won't you just die?" His scream echoed off the brick walls. I rolled down the window of the sedan just an inch to hear him better. "I am not going to die, son," I whispered into the cold night air. "I am just getting started." Trey turned and stormed back toward the house, slamming the back door so hard the security light rattled. I looked at Sarah. "He didn't have the title," she said softly. "No," I said. "He doesn't have the title, he doesn't have the deed. And as of tonight, he doesn't have $2,000. I sat back in the seat. "Drive Sarah. I have a date with a lighting system." "A lighting system?" she asked. "Tomorrow night they are having a party," I said. "A victory party. They think they survived the open house. They think the car incident was just bad luck." I looked at my hands. I am going to turn their victory party into a ghost story. I closed my eyes, imagining the wiring diagram of my house, the main breaker panel, the smart home hub. I had installed it all. I knew the IP addresses. I knew the override codes. Trey called my car a coffin. Tomorrow night, I am going to show him what it feels like to be buried alive. The house looked like a lantern glowing against the black canvas of the Chicago night. From my vantage point in the detached garage where I had set up my command center, I could see everything. The curtains were open. They wanted the world to see their happiness. They wanted the neighbors to see that life goes on even when the patriarch disappears into the winter fog. It was 9 o'clock on Saturday night. Brittany called it an intimate gathering. I called it a victory lap. There were 6 cars parked in the driveway, including a Porsche and a sleek Mercedes. They belonged to the kind of friends Brittany cultivated. People who measured their self-worth by the thread count of their suits and the zip codes of their investment properties. I sat on a folding chair in the cold garage, my laptop open on a workbench covered in sawdust. The screen glowed with the feed from the interior security cameras. I watched them circulate in my living room, holding my crystal glasses, drinking the wine I had been saving for a special occasion. There was Jason, a hedge fund manager who had once tried to sell me a timeshare in Dubai. There was Chloe, a woman who ran a charity that spent more on galas than on actual aid. And in the center of it all were my son and his wife. Trey was wearing a velvet smoking jacket that made him look like a caricature of a wealthy heir. He was flushed, loud, and drunk. He had his arm around Brittany, who looked predatory in a red silk dress. They looked like the kings of the world. They looked like they had gotten away with murder. I adjusted the volume on my laptop. The microphone and the smart speaker on the mantel picked up their conversation with crystal clarity. "To new beginnings," Trey shouted, raising his glass. The room fell silent. "To freedom," Brittany added, clinking her glass against his. "And to moving forward without unnecessary baggage." The guests laughed. It was a polite, cruel laughter. "Poor Langston," Jason said, taking a sip of scotch. "It is tragic, really, wandering off like that. But you two have held up remarkably well." "We do what we must," Brittany said, putting on her sad face. "It is what he would have wanted, for us to live our lives, for us to not be burdened by the past." I watched them drink. I watched them smile. My hands hovered over the keyboard. They thought they owned the house. They thought that because they changed the locks on the doors, they controlled the environment. But they forgot who wired this place. They forgot that in 2005, I installed the entire smart home system myself. I hardwired the servers. I set the admin codes, and I never wrote them down. To them, the house was a collection of rooms. To me, it was a machine, and I was the operator. I looked at the code running on my screen. I had written a simple script, a sequence of events designed to dismantle their composure layer by layer. "It is time," I whispered to the empty garage. I hit the enter key. Inside the house, the lights didn't just go out. They died. One second, the room was bathed in the warm yellow glow of the chandeliers. The next second, it was plunged into absolute pitch blackness, not a dimmer switch fading down. A hard instant cut. On the screen, the infrared cameras kicked in, turning the scene into a ghostly green and gray. I saw the guests freeze. I heard the gasp of surprise followed by the nervous laughter that people use when they are trying to convince themselves everything is fine. "Just a fuse," Trey yelled, his voice a little too high. "Old wiring. Dad never updated the breaker box. I'll go check it." He didn't move, though. I saw him standing there clutching his drink. He was terrified of the dark. He always had been since he was a boy. The room was silent, save for the rustling of fabric and the clinking of ice in glasses. Then I initiated phase 2. I didn't turn the lights back on. Instead, I activated the surround sound system. I had installed high-fidelity speakers in the ceiling years ago for listening to jazz. They were powerful enough to shake the floorboards. I queued up the audio file. It wasn't music. It was the recording I had made in the basement 2 days ago. The recording of Brittany talking to Trey while I hid in the ductwork. I set the volume to maximum. "The old man is gone." Brittany's voice boomed through the dark room. It was distorted slightly by the volume, making it sound hollow and omnipresent. It sounded like God speaking from the clouds if God was a greedy real estate agent. In the green glow of the camera, I saw Brittany drop her wine glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, but the sound was swallowed by her own voice echoing from the ceiling. "He is confused. He wandered off at O'Hare. By the time social services processes him, he will be in a state facility." "What is that?" Jason yelled, backing away toward the wall. "Who is saying that?" It's a glitch," Brittany shrieked. Her voice in the room mixed with her voice on the recording, creating a terrifying harmony of guilt. "Trey, turn it off. We are selling everything." The house, the vintage car, the portfolio. We are cashing out. Trey was spinning in circles, looking at the ceiling. "Dad," he whimpered. "Dad, is that you?" I typed a command. The lights flickered. On, off, on, off. A strobe effect that turned the room into a nightmare of flashing images. I saw the guests' faces. They weren't polite anymore. They were horrified. They were hearing a confession broadcast at 100 decibels. "He won't last a month. He doesn't remember his own name." "Stop it," Brittany screamed, covering her ears. She ran toward the smart hub on the wall, tearing at the panel, but the controls were locked out. I had overridden the manual inputs. I spoke into the microphone connected to my laptop. I didn't use a voice changer. I didn't need to. My voice was deep enough, and through the speakers it sounded like Judgment Day. "I remember my name," I said. The room went dead silent. The recording stopped. The strobe lights stopped, leaving them in total darkness again. Trey fell to his knees. I saw him on the infrared camera. He was shaking. "Dad," he whispered into the dark. "Dad, are you a ghost?" "I am not a ghost." "Trey," I said, my voice filling the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "I am the landlord, and the rent is past due." One of the guests. Chloe let out a scream. "I am leaving," she yelled. "This is sick. You people are sick." I heard the sound of people scrambling for the door. They were knocking over furniture, tripping over each other in their haste to escape the haunted house. I watched them run out the front door, jumping into their expensive cars, not caring about their coats or their dignity. Within 30 seconds, the house was empty except for Trey and Brittany. They stood in the dark living room alone. Brittany was breathing hard. I could hear her hyperventilating through the system. "It's a hack," she hissed, trying to regain control. "Someone hacked the system. It's a prank. It's probably some neighborhood kid." "A prank," Trey cried. That was his voice. "Brittany, that was his voice. He is dead. We killed him, and now he is haunting us." "Shut up!" Brittany slapped him. I saw the movement on the camera, a sharp, violent strike. "He is not a ghost. Ghosts don't hack Wi-Fi." I leaned into the microphone. "You didn't kill me, Brittany," I said softly. "You just woke me up." Then I played the final clip, the one I had saved for the end. Haldol. I put 300 milligrams in his coffee. The sound of her own confession, her admission of attempted murder, hung in the air. Trey backed away from her. Even in the dark, I could feel his revulsion, or maybe it was just fear that she would do the same to him. You said that on the phone," Trey whispered. "You said that out loud." Brittany didn't answer. She was looking around the room, her eyes wild, trying to find the camera, trying to find the source. "Show yourself," she screamed. "If you are alive, show yourself, you coward." I didn't answer. Instead, I cut the power to the heating system. I heard the furnace in the basement shut down with a heavy clunk. The fan stopped whirring. The house fell silent. It was 10 degrees outside. Within an hour, that house would be an icebox. I sat back in my chair in the garage. I was warm. I had a space heater. I had a thermos of coffee. Let them sit in the cold, I thought. Let them sit in the dark with nothing but their guilt and the sound of the wind. I watched them on the screen. Trey was curling into a ball on the sofa, sobbing. Brittany was pacing frantically, using her cell phone flashlight to look for a way to reset the system. But she wouldn't find one. I had locked the breaker panel with a physical padlock before I left. They were trapped in the luxury prison they had stolen. I closed the laptop. Tonight was the ghost story. Tomorrow would be the reality check. Tomorrow I would introduce them to the only thing scarier than a ghost: a forensic accountant. The morning sun rose over Chicago, cold and indifferent, illuminating a house that had become a freezer. I sat in my garage, wrapped in my wool coat, watching the security feed. Inside the house, Trey and Brittany were huddled under blankets on the living room floor. The furnace was still off. The smart home system was still locked down. They looked like refugees in their own kingdom, shivering in their designer clothes. But the cold air wasn't the only thing biting them today. I was about to introduce a new element to their misery. On the workbench in front of me sat an iPad. It wasn't the new one Brittany carried around like a scepter. It was an older model with a cracked screen that I had found in a cardboard box near the garage door marked electronics, $50. In her haste to liquidate my assets, Brittany had thrown her old digital life into the bargain bin. She assumed it was wiped. She assumed it was trash. She assumed wrong. I plugged it in. The battery icon flashed red, then green. It booted up. It asked for a passcode. I didn't need to hack it. I knew Brittany. She was arrogant, and arrogance makes people lazy. I tried her birthday. Incorrect. I tried the date of her wedding to Trey. Incorrect. Then I tried the one thing she truly loved. Money. The numbers corresponding to the letters on the keypad. 66639. The screen unlocked. I tapped on the message icon. The device immediately synced with the Wi-Fi network I controlled, pulling down the latest backup from her iCloud account. I scrolled past the messages to Trey. They were boring, mostly instructions on what to buy or complaints about his incompetence. Then I saw a thread pinned to the top. The contact name was Realtor Mark. I opened it. The messages were not about real estate. They were graphic. They were intimate. But what caught my engineer's eye wasn't the infidelity. It was the logistics. Mark, when do we fly Brittany Friday? As soon as the wire transfer clears from the house sale. Mark. What about the husband, Brittany? He stays. The debt is in his name. I transferred the liabilities to his personal account last week. Once we hit the Cayman Islands, he can rot in bankruptcy court for all I care. He is dead weight, Mark. Just like his father. I sat back in my folding chair. My breath clouded in the cold air. She wasn't just stealing from me. She was stealing from Trey. She was setting him up to take the fall for everything. The forged loans, the stolen assets, the tax evasion. She was going to board a plane with my money and leave my son drowning in a sea of debt and criminal charges. I felt a strange pang in my chest. I hated what Trey had done to me. I hated his weakness. But seeing him being played for a fool by this woman woke up a dormant instinct. The instinct to protect the cub even if the cub has bitten you. I connected the iPad to my portable printer. Whir-click, whir-click. The pages slid out one by one. Screenshots of the affair. Screenshots of the offshore bank account numbers she had opened in her name only. Screenshots of her calling Trey a useful idiot. I took the stack of papers. They were warm from the printer. I needed Trey to see this, but I couldn't just hand it to him. If I revealed myself now, the game would change. They might unite against me out of fear. No, I needed them to turn on each other. I needed to divide the enemy force. I looked around the garage. On a shelf near the door sat a thick folder labeled Property Disclosures. It was the packet Brittany had prepared for the open house, full of fake inspection reports and glossy photos. Trey had brought it out here yesterday when he was trying to sell the car, hoping the title was inside. He had left it on the workbench in his frustration. I slid the printed screenshots into the middle of the folder right between the foundation report and the roof certification. Then I waited. I knew Trey's routine. When he was stressed, he paced. When he paced, he eventually ended up in the garage seeking refuge from Brittany's constant criticism. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the back door of the house opened. Trey stepped out. He was wrapped in a duvet, looking ridiculous and pathetic. He was shivering violently. He walked toward the garage, probably hoping to find a space heater or just to get away from the freezing house. I slipped into the shadows behind the stacked boxes of books. Trey entered the garage. He didn't see me. He went straight to the electrical panel on the wall, flipping breakers, trying uselessly to restore power to the house. "Come on," he muttered, kicking the wall. "Come on, you piece of junk work." He gave up. He turned around and leaned against the workbench. His eyes fell on the Property Disclosures folder. He picked it up aimlessly, flipping through the pages. I held my breath. He flipped past the photos. He flipped past the survey. Then he stopped. I saw his posture change. He froze. He brought the paper closer to his face, squinting in the dim light. He read the first page. Then he frantically turned to the next. And the next. I saw his knees buckle. He grabbed the edge of the workbench to hold himself up. He let out a sound that wasn't a word. It was a low, guttural whine of an animal caught in a trap. He dropped the folder. The papers scattered across the concrete floor. Mark. Cayman Islands. Dead weight. Trey stared at the papers for a long moment. Then a change came over him. The shivering stopped. His face, which had been pale and frightened, turned a dark, mottled red. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He grabbed the papers in his fist, crushing them. He turned and ran back to the house. He didn't close the door. He kicked it open. I moved quickly to my laptop, turning up the volume on the kitchen microphone. I heard the door slam against the wall. Brittany Trey screamed. His voice was unrecognizable. It was raw, shredded by betrayal. I watched the camera feed. Brittany was in the kitchen trying to boil water on the gas stove to stay warm. She jumped, dropping the kettle. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped. "You scared me half to death." Trey threw the crumpled papers at her. They hit her in the chest and fell to the floor like snow. "Who is Mark?" Trey screamed. Brittany froze. She looked at the papers on the floor. She saw the familiar layout of her own text messages. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. Her face went white. "It doesn't matter where I got them," Trey yelled, advancing on her. "You are leaving. You are going to the Caymans with my money." Brittany laughed. It was a sharp, hysterical sound. "Your money," she spat. "What money, Trey? You don't have any money. Your daddy has money. I have money. You have debt. You have a gambling problem. You have a spine made of jelly." Trey stopped. He looked like she had slapped him. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice shaking. "I drugged my own father for you. I committed a felony for you." "And you almost botched that too," Brittany screamed back. She abandoned the pretense. The mask fell off completely, revealing the ugly truth beneath. "You think I married you for your personality?" she sneered, stepping closer to him, pushing him back. "Look at you. You are 32 years old, and you still need your daddy to pay your credit card bill. You are pathetic, Trey. You are a child." Trey backed up until he hit the island counter. "But you said you loved me." "I love the lifestyle," Brittany said coldly. "I love the house. I love the potential. But I realized about a year ago that the only way to get the value out of you was to liquidate the assets and move on. You are not a partner, Trey. You are an anchor, and I am cutting the rope." She kicked the papers on the floor. "So yes, I am leaving. I am taking the money from the house sale, and I am going with Mark. Because Mark is a man. Mark knows how to close a deal. You couldn't even sell a car in an alley without getting caught by the cops." Trey stared at her. The woman he had betrayed his blood for. The woman he had poisoned his father for. "You used me," he whispered. Brittany rolled her eyes. "Grow up. Everyone uses everyone. Your dad used you to feel important. I used you to get comfortable. And you used me to do the dirty work you were too scared to do yourself. You wanted him gone just as much as I did Trey. Don't play the saint now." She turned back to the stove. "Now get out of my face. I need to make tea. And then I am calling a locksmith to get this damn smart system reset so we can sell this icebox and I can get on that plane." Trey stood there trembling. I watched on the screen. I saw his hand move. It moved toward the heavy cast iron skillet sitting on the drying rack. For a second I thought he was going to hit her. I tensed up, ready to intervene, ready to call the police. I wanted them destroyed, not dead. But Trey didn't pick up the skillet. He swept it off the counter. It crashed onto the floor with a deafening clang, cracking the expensive Italian tile Brittany had insisted on installing last year. Brittany screamed and jumped back. "You want to sell the house?" Trey yelled, his eyes crazy. "You want the money." He grabbed a chair from the dining table and smashed it against the granite countertop. Wood splintered. "There is no money," he screamed. "It's gone. The open house failed. The car sale failed. And now the house is going to fail." He picked up a bottle of olive oil and threw it against the wall. It shattered, leaving a greasy stain on the wallpaper. "Stop it!" Brittany shrieked, trying to grab him. "You are ruining the resale value." "I don't care," Trey roared, pushing her away. "If I am an anchor, then watch me sink the ship." He started tearing the kitchen apart. He pulled drawers out and dumped them. He swept the toaster and the blender onto the floor. He was a whirlwind of destruction, a toddler throwing a tantrum with the strength of a grown man. Brittany backed away terrified. This wasn't the weak, pliable Trey she knew. This was something else. This was the rage of a fool who realizes he has been played. I watched from the garage. "Good," I whispered. "Break it. Break it all. Let them destroy the kitchen. Let them destroy the tile." Because with every plate he smashed, he was smashing the illusion that held them together. Trey stopped, panting heavily amidst the wreckage of the kitchen. He looked at Brittany. "Get out," he said. Brittany straightened her coat. She looked at the mess. She looked at him with pure disgust. "Gladly," she said. "I was leaving anyway. Have fun explaining this to the bank when they foreclose." She stepped over the broken glass and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door slam. Trey slid down the cabinets until he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by broken porcelain and olive oil. He put his head in his hands and began to weep. I sat in the garage listening to him cry. It was an ugly sound. but it was the first honest sound I had heard from him in years. He was alone now, truly alone. The wife was gone. The money was gone. The father was gone. I closed the laptop. Phase 2 was complete. The alliance was broken. Now it was time for the endgame. I stood up and walked into the corner of the garage where I kept my old suit carrier. I unzipped it. Inside was a black suit, a funeral suit. But I wasn't going to a funeral. I was going to a resurrection. Tomorrow Brittany would try to finalize the sale paperwork remotely. Tomorrow Trey would try to pick up the pieces. And tomorrow I would walk into the church where they were planning to hold my memorial service, and I would speak from the dead. I touched the fabric of the suit. Get ready, Langston, I told myself. It is showtime. The sanctuary of the First Corinthian Baptist Church smelled of beeswax polish and white lilies. It was a smell I had known my entire life. I was baptized in that font. I married Lucille at that altar. And in 1982, when a heavy snowstorm threatened to collapse the roof, I was the one who designed the steel reinforcements that held it up. I knew every beam and every bolt in this building. I knew where the floorboards creaked and where the acoustics were perfect. That is why I chose the choir loft. Specifically, the dark corner behind the pipe organ where the shadows were thickest and the view of the pulpit was unobstructed. I sat there dressed in my charcoal suit, my hands resting on the silver handle of my cane, watching my own funeral. It wasn't technically a funeral. They couldn't have a funeral because they didn't have a body. Brittany had been very specific about the terminology. It was a celebration of life and a prayer for the missing. It was a legal maneuver dressed up in Sunday best. She needed a public declaration of my disappearance to file the claim on my $2 million life insurance policy. She needed witnesses to testify that the family was grieving and that the search had been exhausted. I looked down at the pews. They were filling up. My community had turned out. There was Mr. Henderson from the bank sitting in the third row. He looked solemn, but I saw him catch the eye of Dr. Eris, who was sitting across the aisle. They exchanged a subtle nod. My soldiers were in position. There was Mrs. Gable, my next-door neighbor, who had brought a casserole dish that probably contained her famous peach cobbler. There were the men from the lodge. There were the young engineers I had mentored. They were all there to say goodbye to Langston Barnes. Their grief was real. I could feel it rising to the rafters like smoke. It pained me to see them hurting, but it was necessary. They were the audience for the play my son was about to perform, and there in the front row sat the directors of this farce. Brittany was a vision of calculated sorrow. She wore a black dress that was modest enough for church but tight enough to show she was still young and available. She had a lace handkerchief in her hand, which she dabbed at dry eyes every time someone looked her way. She wasn't looking at the altar. She was looking at her watch. She was checking the time because she had a flight to catch. She was checking the time because every minute she spent in this church was a minute she wasn't spending in the Cayman Islands with her lover Mark. Next to her sat Trey. My son looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The arrogance he had shown in the garage was gone. The rage he had unleashed in the kitchen had burned itself out, leaving only ash. He was wearing his black suit, but his tie was crooked. He was sweating profusely despite the cool air in the sanctuary. He kept bouncing his leg, a nervous tic he had developed as a child when he was lying about his homework. He looked terrified. And he should be. He thought he was haunted. He thought his father was a ghost hacking his smart home. He thought his wife was leaving him. And he knew that sitting 3 rows behind him was a man in a gray suit with a briefcase, the insurance adjuster from State Farm. I had called the insurance company anonymously 2 days ago. I told them they might want to attend the service. I told them there were discrepancies in the timeline of the disappearance. The organ music swelled a mournful rendition of Amazing Grace. It was beautiful, but to me, it sounded like a countdown. The Reverend Jenkins stepped up to the pulpit. He was a good man, a man of God, who believed the best in people. He didn't know he was presiding over a crime scene. "We gather today," he boomed, his voice resonating off the timbers I had reinforced to honor a pillar of this community. Langston Barnes was not just a builder of bridges. He was a builder of men. He was a father, a husband, a friend. I watched Trey flinch at the word father. He stared at his shoes. Brittany nudged him. I saw it clearly from my perch, a sharp elbow to the ribs. She leaned in and whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I could read the body language. "Sit up. Look sad. Don't blow this." The Reverend continued speaking about my charity work, about the time I fixed the church boiler for free, about my devotion to Lucille. Every word was a compliment to me and an indictment of the son who had abandoned me. And now the Reverend said, looking down at the front row, we ask his son Trey Barnes to come forward and share a few words. This was it. The performance. Trey didn't move at first. He looked frozen. He looked like he was glued to the pew. Brittany grabbed his hand and squeezed it hard. It looked like comfort to the crowd, but I knew it was a threat. She was crushing his fingers. Get up. Trey stood up slowly. His legs were shaky. He walked to the pulpit, gripping the sides of the wood as if he were on a boat in a storm. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the friends I had made over 70 years. He saw the people who loved me, and he saw the lie he had to tell them. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled against the microphone. He cleared his throat. Ahem. My father, he started, his voice cracking. My father was a great man. He paused. He looked at Brittany. She stared back at him, her eyes hard as flint. He was a strong man, Trey continued, gaining a little momentum. He taught me everything I know. He taught me how to be a man. I gripped my cane. Liar, I taught you how to be a man, but you didn't learn. You learned how to be a parasite. But, Trey said, wiping sweat from his forehead toward the end, he wasn't himself. The dementia, it took him from us long before the airport. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Gable shook her head, dabbing her eyes. They bought it. They trusted him because he was my blood. I remember, Trey stammered, going off script. I remember when I was 10. He bought that red Cadillac, Bessie. He loved that car. He used to let me steer it while he worked the pedals. He said, a car like that is a legacy. You have to take care of it or it rusts. Trey's voice broke. This time it wasn't fake. He was thinking about the car he tried to sell for scrap. He was thinking about pushing it back into the garage in the snow. I tried to take care of him, Trey sobbed. I really did. But the disease, it was too strong. At the airport, I turned my back for 1 second, just 1 second to get a wheelchair, and he was gone. He looked at the insurance adjuster in the back row. He was pleading with him, believe me, please believe me. I searched for him. Trey cried, tears streaming down his face. I searched every terminal. I called his name, but he wandered away. He left me. The audacity. He was flipping the narrative. He was the victim. I was the one who abandoned him. We pray for his return, Trey said, reading from the paper again. But we must be realistic. It has been 5 days. Without his medication. In this cold. He couldn't finish the sentence. He bowed his head. Brittany stood up and walked to the pulpit. She put a comforting arm around him. She looked at the crowd with a tragic, brave face. Thank you, she said, her voice steady and clear. We know Langston is with the angels now, or he is at peace. All we can do is honor his memory by moving forward, by living the life he wanted for us. She looked at the insurance adjuster. He wanted us to be secure, she said. He worked hard so his family would be taken care of. That was his greatest wish. I stood up in the shadows of the choir loft. No, Brittany, I whispered. My greatest wish was for my son to have a spine. The Reverend Jenkins stood up to take over the service. Thank you, Brother Trey. Sister Brittany. Let us bow our heads in prayer. The congregation bowed their heads. The sanctuary fell silent. I buttoned my jacket. I adjusted my tie. It was time. The script demanded that they mourn me. The script demanded that they sign the papers and collect the check. The script demanded that I fade away into the history of Bronzeville, a sad story about an old man who lost his mind. But I had a rewrite. I walked to the stairs of the choir loft. My heavy boots made a dull thud on the wood. Thud, thud, thud. In the silence of the prayer, the sound echoed like a heartbeat. Reverend Jenkins looked up. He squinted toward the balcony. Trey looked up. His face went white. Brittany froze. I didn't stop. I walked down the stairs. I walked out of the shadows and into the light of the stained glass window. The sun hit me, turning my gray suit to silver. I stood on the balcony overlooking the congregation. I looked like a patriarch looking down on his flock. I looked directly at Trey. Amen, I said, my voice booming without a microphone filling the vaulted ceiling I had built. The Reverend dropped his Bible. Mrs. Gable screamed. Trey fell backward, knocking over the flower arrangement. Brittany stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. I gripped the railing. "That was a beautiful speech, son," I said, my voice cold and hard, "but you got one thing wrong." The entire church turned to look at me, 400 faces staring at a dead man walking. "I didn't wander away," I said. "I was waiting for my ride." The silence that followed the Reverend's prayer was heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a burial, the moment when the casket is lowered into the earth and the reality of loss becomes physical. But in this church, the silence was built on a foundation of lies. My son stood at the pulpit, head bowed, acting the part of the grieving orphan. My daughter-in-law stood beside him, her hand on his back, playing the role of the stoic widow. The congregation sat with heads bowed, respectful of a tragedy that had never happened. They were waiting for the choir to sing. They were waiting for the benediction. They were waiting for permission to go home and eat potato salad and talk about poor old Langston Barnes. Instead, they got Judgment Day. It started with a sound from the back of the sanctuary. Not a whisper, not a cough. It was the heavy metallic clank of the double doors being unbarred. The great oak doors of the First Corinthian Baptist Church were designed to be heavy. They were designed to keep the world out and the spirit in. Opening them required strength. Opening them required purpose. Boom! The doors swung open. Both of them. They hit the back walls of the narthex with a thunderous crash that shook the dust from the rafters. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. 400 heads snapped around. Necks craned. Eyes widened. The bright midday sun flooded into the dim sanctuary, cutting through the gloom like a laser. Dust motes danced in the beam, creating a blinding white corridor of light down the center aisle. Silhouetted against that blinding light stood 3 figures. To the left stood Sheriff Johnson, a man whose uniform was as crisp as his reputation. His hand rested casually on his belt, not threatening but promising order. To the right stood Sarah, my attorney. She held her briefcase like a weapon, her silhouette sharp and uncompromising in her power suit. And in the center stood me. I stepped out of the glare and into the room. I was not the confused old man in a cardigan that Trey had described. I was not the frail dementia patient Brittany had painted for the insurance adjuster. I was wearing my Italian charcoal suit. My shirt was starched white. My tie was silk, a deep crimson red, the color of power. I was clean-shaven, my jaw set like granite. I held my walking stick not for support, but like a scepter. I stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, and in that moment I felt like I was 10 feet tall. For 3 seconds nobody moved. The shock was so absolute it paralyzed them. Their brains could not process the data. They had just spent an hour mourning a dead man, and now that man was standing there looking healthier than anyone in the room. Then the sound started. It started as a ripple, a low murmur from the back pews as people recognized me. "It's him. Lord have mercy. Is that Langston?" Then the ripple turned into a wave. People stood up. Mrs. Gable in the 4th row let out a scream that sounded halfway between terror and rapture. She clutched her chest and sat back down, fanning herself frantically with a hymnal. Mr. Henderson from the bank stood up and smiled a grim, satisfied smile. He nudged Dr. Aris, who nodded slowly, crossing his arms. They knew, but seeing the resurrection in person, was something else entirely. I began to walk. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate cadence of a structural engineer inspecting a site. My heels clicked on the floorboards. Click, click, click. The sound echoed into the cavernous space, cutting through the murmurs. I looked straight ahead. I didn't look at my friends. I didn't look at the neighbors. My eyes were locked on the pulpit. I saw Trey. He was standing there frozen. His face, which had been flushed with fake grief, drained of color instantly. It went past pale. It went gray. He looked like a corpse that had been propped up for a viewing. His eyes were bulging, almost popping out of his head. His mouth hung open, a dark O of pure terror. He was seeing a ghost. In his mind, he had killed me. He had drugged me. He had abandoned me. He had erased me. Logic told him I couldn't be there. Guilt told him I was a spirit coming for his soul. His hand went slack. Thunk screech! The microphone slipped from his fingers. It hit the wooden floor of the pulpit and rolled. The feedback loop shrieked through the speakers, a high-pitched, piercing wail that made everyone cover their ears. Trey didn't cover his ears. He couldn't move. He just stared at me, shaking violently. Next to him, Brittany reacted differently. Brittany didn't believe in ghosts. Brittany believed in leverage. And in 1 second, She saw her leverage evaporate. She stared at me, and then her eyes darted to the sheriff standing by the door. She did the math instantly. She saw the suit. She saw the clarity in my eyes. She saw the trap snapping shut. Her legs gave out. She didn't faint. She was too controlling to faint, but she stumbled, gripping the edge of the pulpit to keep from collapsing. Her knuckles turned white. Her perfect mask of the grieving daughter-in-law cracked and fell away, leaving behind the naked face of a cornered rat. I kept walking. I passed the 5th row. I passed the 4th row. The insurance adjuster from State Farm was sitting on the edge of the pew. He looked at me, then he looked at the file on his lap, then he looked at Trey. He closed the file with a snap. He pulled a pen from his pocket and drew a thick line through the claim form. He looked angry. He realized he had been played, and nobody likes to be played. I reached the front of the church. The choir members were standing up, looking over the railing, whispering. The organist had spun around on his bench, his hands hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play a funeral dirge or a victory march. I stopped at the bottom of the steps leading to the pulpit. The feedback from the microphone finally died down, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I looked up at my son. He was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering. It was a pathetic sound in the quiet church. Click, click, click. "Dad," he whispered. It was barely a breath. "Dad." He reached a hand out as if to touch me to see if I was solid, but he pulled it back, terrified of what he might feel. I walked up the 3 steps. I stood next to him. I smelled the sweat of his fear. It smelled sour. I smelled the expensive cologne I had paid for. I turned to face the congregation. I looked at the hundreds of faces staring back at me in awe. Then I turned to Brittany. She was backed against the organ looking for an exit, but there was no exit. Sarah, my lawyer, had moved quietly up the side aisle and was standing right there blocking the vestry door. Brittany was trapped. I looked back at Trey. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. I didn't squeeze. I just let the weight of my hand rest there. The weight of his father. The weight of his creator. The weight of the man whose name he carried. He flinched as if my hand were red-hot iron. He whimpered. I leaned into the microphone. I didn't need to adjust it. My voice was strong enough on its own, but I wanted every syllable to be recorded. I wanted the insurance adjuster to hear it. I wanted the sheriff to hear it. I wanted God to hear it. I looked Trey in the eye. "Son," I said, my voice calm, deep, and resonant. Trey's knees buckled. He grabbed the podium to stay upright. "That was a beautiful eulogy," I continued. The words hung in the air. "Really, I was touched. You have a gift for fiction." Trey started to sob, not the fake tears from before. These were real, ugly, breathless sobs of panic. "Dad, I thought..." I smiled. It was a cold smile, a winter smile. "I know what you thought, Trey. You thought I was gone. You thought the pills worked. You thought the cold took me." I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "It is a shame," I said. "What?" Trey choked out. "It is a shame I am not dead," I said, my eyes boring into his. "Because if I were dead, I wouldn't be able to see the look on your face right now." I patted his cheek. It was a demeaning gesture, the kind you give to a child who has disappointed you. "And I wouldn't be able to introduce you to these nice people I brought with me." I gestured to the back of the church. Sheriff Johnson walked forward. His boots were loud on the floor. He walked straight down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Brittany. Brittany let out a screech. It was a primal sound. "No, you can't. This is a misunderstanding. He is sick. He is confused." I turned to her. "I am not confused, Brittany," I said. "In fact, I have never been clearer." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the toxicology report Marcus had printed for me. I held it up. "I know about the Haldol," I said. "I know about the scopolamine. I know about the digoxin." Brittany stopped screaming. Her mouth snapped shut. "And I know about the airport," I added. I turned back to the congregation. "My family told you I was lost. They told you I wandered away." I paused, letting the tension build until it was unbearable. "They didn't lose me. They left me. They drove me to O'Hare, took my ID, took my money, and told me to wait for a wheelchair that was never coming. They left a 72-year-old man on a bench like a bag of trash and drove home to drink my wine." A gasp of horror went through the room. Angry murmurs started. People were standing up, pointing. "Shame, shame on you." Trey slid down the front of the podium until he was sitting on the floor, crying into his hands. I didn't mean to, he wailed. She made me do it. She said it was the only way. I looked down at him. My son, my legacy, blaming his wife, blaming the world, still refusing to be a man. I looked out at the church. The funeral is canceled, I announced. I looked at the sheriff. But I think the trial is just beginning. Sheriff Johnson stepped onto the pulpit. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted in the sunlight. Brittany tried to run. She lunged toward the choir stalls, knocking over a music stand. But she wasn't fast enough. The sheriff grabbed her arm. She spun around, clawing at him. Get off me! Do you know who I am? You are a suspect in an attempted murder investigation, ma'am, the sheriff said, spinning her around and clicking the cuffs onto her wrists. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it, he turned to Trey. Get up, son, the sheriff said. You too. Trey couldn't get up. The deputy had to come down the aisle and hoist him to his feet. He was limp. He was weeping uncontrollably, calling my name. Dad, Daddy, help me. Please don't let them take me. I stood there, leaning on my cane, watching them drag my son away in handcuffs. He looked back at me, his face streaked with snot and tears, begging for the rescue that had always come before. But today I didn't move. I didn't reach for my checkbook. I didn't call a lawyer. I just watched. And as the doors of the church swung shut behind them, leaving me alone at the altar, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The storm was over. The structure had held. I turned to the Reverend. Reverend, I said, I think we have the room booked for another hour. Yes. Langston, the Reverend whispered, staring at me with awe. Good, I said. I walked over to the piano in the corner. I sat down on the bench. I didn't die today, Reverend, so I think we should sing something about life. I hit a C major chord. It rang out bright and clear, chasing the shadows away. The congregation stood up. They clapped. They cheered. But I just played. I played for myself. I played for the man who walked out of the airport and found his way home. The sheriff had the handcuffs on them. The metal clicked shut with a finality that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Trey was sobbing, his knees scraping the floor, and Brittany was still trying to shout about her rights, claiming this was a mistake, a prank, a misunderstanding. The deputies were ready to drag them out the center aisle, past the rows of stunned faces, out into the sunlight and into the back of a squad car. But I wasn't done. Sheriff, I said, my voice booming from the pulpit without the need for a microphone. Hold them, just for a moment. Sheriff Johnson stopped. He looked at me, gave a slight nod, and signaled his deputies to wait. He turned Brittany and Trey around so they were facing the congregation, facing the people they had tried to fool, facing the community they had insulted with their lies. They are going to prison, I said, looking out at the 400 people sitting in the pews. That is a matter of law. But before they go, I want this family, my family, the people of Bronzeville, to know exactly why. I want you to see the architecture of a betrayal. I gestured to the choir loft. Sarah, my attorney, was already connecting her laptop to the church's audiovisual system. The large white screen that was usually used to project hymn lyrics slowly descended from the ceiling. It hummed as it lowered a white canvas, waiting for the ugly truth. You all came here to mourn a man who lost his mind, I said, gripping the lectern. You came to pity Langston Barnes. You whispered that it was a tragedy, that dementia is a cruel thief. I pointed my cane at Brittany, but dementia didn't steal my mind. She did. The screen flickered to life. Exhibit A, I said calmly. The image that appeared was stark and scientific. It was the toxicology report from Dr. Aris's lab. The graph lines spiked high in red ink. The chemical names were blown up large enough for everyone in the back row to read. Dr. Aris stood up in his pew. He turned to the crowd. I ran this blood panel myself yesterday morning, he said, his voice grave. This is the blood of Langston Barnes. It contains lethal levels of haloperidol and scopolamine. These are not medications for memory loss. They are chemical restraints. They are poisons designed to induce confusion, pliability, and eventually cardiac arrest. A gasp ripped through the room. It was a physical sound, like all the air being sucked out of the sanctuary at once. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with a gloved hand. The insurance adjuster's jaw dropped. I looked at Brittany. She was staring at the screen, her face the color of ash. She knew that document. She knew what it meant. There was no spinning this. Science does not lie. She drugged me every morning, I said, my voice low and dangerous. She put it in my coffee. She put it in my juice. She watched me stumble. She watched me forget names. And she told you all it was nature taking its course. She smiled while she erased me. Trey looked up at the screen. He was shaking his head violently. I didn't know he wailed. I swear, Dad, I didn't know it was poison. She said it was vitamins. She said it would help you. I looked down at my son. Even now at the end he was trying to hide behind her skirt. You didn't know I asked. I nodded to Sarah. Exhibit B. The screen changed. The image was grainy, shot in high-contrast black and white infrared. It was the security feed from my kitchen. The timestamp was 3 days ago, the morning of the airport trip. On the massive screen, the entire church watched Brittany standing at the granite island. She was wearing her silk robe. She looked relaxed, happy even. She opened her purse. She took out a white bottle. She poured a handful of blue pills onto the counter. Then she took a heavy mortar and pestle. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound wasn't on the video, but everyone could imagine it. She ground the pills into a fine powder. She dumped the powder into my favorite mug, the mug that said, "World's Best Dad." She poured the coffee over it. She stirred it with a silver spoon. Then the video showed Trey walking into the frame. The congregation leaned forward. Trey walked up to her. He kissed her on the cheek. He looked at the mug. He looked at the powder residue on the counter. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask why she was crushing pills. He laughed. On the screen, my son laughed. He picked up the mug. "Give it to him," he said on the video, his voice tinny but clear. "Make sure he drinks it all. We need him docile for the drive." The video froze on Trey's smiling face holding the poisoned cup. The silence in the church was absolute. It was a heavy, judging silence. Trey hung his head. His body went limp in the deputy's grip. He couldn't look at the screen. He couldn't look at me. "You knew," I said softly. "You handed me the cup, son. You watched me drink it. You watched your father swallow his own death, and you asked for a refill." Neighbors who had known Trey since he was in diapers stood up and turned their backs on him. I saw looks of pure revulsion. To them, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a monster, a parricide. But I wasn't done. The poison was the method, I said. But the motive? The motive was simple greed. "Exhibit C," I said. The screen went black. Then the audio started. It was the recording from the smart speaker the night of the party, the night they celebrated my death. "The old man is gone." Brittany's voice boomed through the church speakers. "He won't last a month. By the time social services processes him, he will be in a state facility." Then Trey's voice. I winced when he looked at me at the gate. He looked like a lost puppy. "But we need the money, Brittany. The house is worth $2 million. Liquidate everything." Brittany's voice again. "The car, the stocks. We are cashing out." I let the recording play until the end. I let them hear the clinking of glasses. I let them hear the laughter of two people celebrating the disposal of an inconvenience. When the audio cut off, the shame in the room was palpable. It was thick enough to choke on. I stepped down from the pulpit. I walked over to where they stood in handcuffs. I looked at the insurance adjuster who was now standing in the aisle, his face red with anger. "Mr. Wilson," I said, "I believe you have everything you need to deny the claim." Mr. Wilson nodded furiously. "I have enough to file fraud charges, Mr. Barnes. Attempted insurance fraud. Conspiracy. This is the most disgusting thing I have seen in 30 years of adjusting." I turned to Mrs. Gable. "Mildred," I said gently, "I am sorry to ruin your Sunday service." Mrs. Gable was crying. She looked at Trey. "I changed your diapers," she whispered. "I baked you cookies. How could you do that to him? He is your father." Trey looked at her. "Mrs. Gable, don't speak to me," she snapped. "You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are dead to this street." I looked at Brittany. She was no longer fighting. She was staring at the floor, defeated by her own arrogance. She realized that she hadn't just lost the money. She had lost her reputation. She had lost her career. No one would ever buy a house from her again. No one would ever trust her. She was branded. And Trey. My son looked at me. His eyes were pleading. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted me to tell the sheriff it was a lesson, a tough love experiment, and that he could go home now. "Dad," he whispered, "please. I am sorry. I was scared. She made me..." I held up my hand. "Stop," I said. I leaned in close so only he and the sheriff could hear. "You aren't going to prison because I am angry, Trey. You are going to prison because you are dangerous. You are dangerous because you are weak. A weak man will do anything to survive. A weak man will poison his own blood to pay a gambling debt." I stood up straight. "I protected you from the world for 32 years, I said loud enough for the room to hear. "I stood between you and the rain. But I realized that I wasn't protecting you. I was enabling you. I was building a shelter for a snake." I looked at the sheriff. "Get them out of my church," I said. Sheriff Johnson nodded. "Move," he barked, pushing them forward. The deputies dragged them down the aisle. And then something happened that wasn't in my script. As they walked past the pews, the congregation didn't just sit there. They stood up. And they turned their backs. Row by row as Trey and Brittany passed. The people of Bronzeville turned around. They faced the back wall. They refused to look at them. They refused to acknowledge their existence. It was a wall of black suits and Sunday hats, a wall of rejection. Trey sobbed louder. This hurt him more than the handcuffs. This was exile. This was the tribe cutting him off. He realized in that moment that he had no home. He had no people. He was an orphan by his own making. I watched them reach the heavy oak doors. Brittany looked back once. Her eyes met mine. There was no hate left in them, only fear. She saw the engineer who had dismantled her life brick by brick. Trey didn't look back. He hung his head, crushed by the weight of his own choices. The doors swung shut with a boom. They were gone. The church was silent again, but the air felt lighter. The poison had been drawn out. The wound was open, but it was clean. I stood at the front of the altar alone. I felt tired. My hip throbbed. My hands shook slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. But I felt something else too. I looked at the empty screen where the evidence of my murder had just been projected. I felt alive. I turned to Sarah. "Do we have the paperwork ready?" I asked. She nodded, tapping her briefcase. "The sale of the house, the donation to the Elder Abuse Fund, it is all drafted." "Good," I said. I looked at the congregation still standing with their backs turned. "You can turn around now," I said softly. "The trash has been taken out." They turned. They looked at me with sorrow and respect. I walked back to the piano. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. The verdict had been delivered not by a judge, but by the people who knew me best. I sat down and played a chord, low and resonant. It was the sound of a foundation settling, the sound of a structure that had weathered the storm and was still standing. The house was empty now. But the man inside was whole. The echo of the heavy oak doors slamming shut was still vibrating in the air, but the sheriff raised his hand, signaling the deputies to stop. They held Trey and Brittany right there in the vestibule, framed by the stained glass that cast long beams of red and blue light across their faces. The congregation had turned around. No one was sitting. 400 people were standing in silent judgment, witnessing the final act of a tragedy that had started in greed and was ending in iron. Sheriff Johnson walked down the center aisle. His boots struck the floorboards with a heavy rhythmic cadence that sounded like the ticking of a clock running out of time. He didn't look like a man doing a job. He looked like a man settling a debt. He had known me for 40 years. He had been at the hospital the night Trey was born. He had given Trey his first ride in a squad car as a birthday treat when he was 6 years old. But there was no affection in his eyes today. There was only the cold, hard steel of the law. He stopped 3 feet from where Trey stood, shivering in the grip of a deputy. He looked my son up and down, his expression one of profound disappointment. Trey Barnes, the sheriff, said, his voice deep and resonant, filling the silent church. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it because every word that has come out of your mouth for the last week has been a lie." Trey sobbed, his legs giving way so that the deputy had to hold him up by his armpits. "Sheriff, please," he choked out. "I didn't do it. It was a mistake. I am grieving." "My father—" Sheriff Johnson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Your father is standing right there," he barked, pointing a gloved finger at me. "Alive, breathing, and judging you." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket. He snapped it open. "We are not arresting you for a mistake, son. We are arresting you on a warrant signed by Judge Patterson this morning, and the list of charges is long enough to keep you in Statesville prison until your hair is as white as your father's." Brittany tried to pull away from the deputy holding her. "This is ridiculous," she screeched. "You have no proof. This is hearsay. That video could be deep-faked. You can't arrest me based on a video." Sheriff Johnson turned his gaze to her. It was a look that would have frozen a fire. "We aren't just arresting you for the video, Mrs. Barnes," he began to read from the warrant, his voice steady and relentless. "Charge 1, attempted murder in the first degree. The toxicology report confirms you administered a lethal cocktail of haloperidol and digoxin to a man with no prescription for either. That is premeditation. That is malice aforethought." Brittany went pale. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Charge 2, the sheriff continued. Aggravated elder abuse and abandonment. You knowingly transported a vulnerable adult to a location with the intent of discarding him. You removed his identification. You removed his means of communication. You left him in freezing conditions with no way to seek help. In the state of Illinois, that is a Class 2 felony." He took a step closer to Trey. "Charge 3, financial exploitation of an elderly person and wire fraud. We have the bank records, Trey. We have the logs from the attempt at First National. We have the attempt to sell the vehicle. And thanks to your father's diligence, we have the IP logs of you accessing his accounts illegally." Trey shook his head violently, tears flying from his face. "No, I didn't access them." "She did. She has the passwords. I just drove the car." Sheriff Johnson lowered the paper. "And finally, charge 4, conspiracy to commit homicide. You planned it, you discussed it, and you executed it. You didn't just want his money, you wanted his life." The sheriff folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "Book them," he said to the deputies. "Take them out the back. I don't want them walking through the front doors. Those doors are for honest people." The deputies yanked them forward. The metal cuffs clicked tighter, digging into their wrists. That was the moment the alliance broke. That was the moment the rats turned on each other. Brittany lunged sideways, not at the deputy, but at Trey. She tried to bite him. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure feral hatred. "You idiot," she screamed, spitting the words at her husband. "You spineless coward, I told you to check the basement. I told you to make sure." She looked at the sheriff, her eyes wide and manic. It was him. It was all him. He wanted the money for his gambling debts. He owes the Russians $50,000. He begged me to help him. I just bought the vitamins. I didn't know what he was doing with them. He made me do it. He said if I didn't help him, he would lose the house. Trey stared at her. The betrayal hit him harder than the handcuffs. The woman who had promised him paradise was now trying to send him to hell alone. "You liar," Trey howled. His voice broke into a high-pitched shriek. "You crushed the pills I saw you. You said he was dead weight. You said we needed to liquidate. You have the tickets to the Cayman Islands in your purse right now. Check her purse, Sheriff. Check her damn purse." Sheriff Johnson smiled grimly. "We already have the purse, son, and the iPad, and the tickets." Brittany screamed a long frustration sound of rage as the deputy dragged her toward the side exit. She kicked and thrashed her heels, scraping sparks against the floor. "I am a victim," she yelled as she was hauled away. "I am a victim of this dysfunctional family. My lawyer will destroy you." Then she was gone, pushed out into the awaiting squad car. Only Trey remained. He wasn't fighting. He had gone limp. He looked small. He looked like the boy who used to hide behind my leg when it thundered. He looked at the floor, then he looked at the sheriff, then finally he looked at me. I was standing by the altar, leaning on my cane. My face was impassive. Inside, I felt a storm of emotions, grief, anger, pity, but I locked them down behind a wall of steel. I was an engineer. I had to be structural. If I bent now, I would break. Trey dragged his feet, resisting the deputy, not with strength, but with weight. He tried to move toward me. "Dad," he wept. "Daddy, please." He fell to his knees, dragging the deputy down with him. He crawled forward a few inches, the chains on his ankles rattling on the wood. "Dad, look at me. It's Trey. It's your boy." I looked down at him. I saw the terror in his eyes. He realized for the first time that there was no safety net. There was no checkbook coming to open the cell door. I didn't mean it. "Dad!" he sobbed, reaching out a hand. I was scared. I was drunk. She confused me. Confused. "I love you, Dad. You know I love you. Please tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you forgive me." He reached for the hem of my trousers. His fingers brushed the fabric of my suit. I stepped back. One single deliberate step. I planted my cane between us, a barrier of hickory and silver. Trey froze his hand, hovering in the air. "Dad," he whispered. I looked him in the eye. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, absolute finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "Don't call me Dad." The words hung in the air, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Trey flinched as if I had struck him. "But I am your son." "No," I said. "My son died 5 days ago." I leaned forward slightly, my eyes boring into his. "My son was a man I raised to have honor. My son was a man I taught to respect his elders. My son was a man who would never leave his father freezing on a bench at O'Hare Airport." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "That man died at the airport, Trey. He froze to death waiting for a wheelchair that never came." Trey shook his head, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the snot on his lip. "No, Dad. I am right here." I straightened up. I looked at the sheriff, then I looked back at the stranger on the floor. "The man kneeling in front of me is not my son," I said, my voice cold as ice. "You are a criminal. You are a thief. And you are a stranger." Trey let out a sound that wasn't human. It was the sound of a soul breaking. "I am not your father anymore," I said. I pointed to myself, to the chest that had beaten with love for him for 32 years. "The man standing here is Mr. Barnes. I am the witness for the prosecution, and I am the man who is going to testify against you in court." Trey stared at me. He saw it then. He saw the door close. He saw the bridge collapse. He realized that no amount of crying, no amount of begging would ever rebuild what he had destroyed. "Sheriff," I said, turning my back on him, "get this man out of my church. He is disrupting the service." Sheriff Johnson nodded. "Get him up," he ordered the deputies. The deputies grabbed Trey by the arms and hauled him to his feet. He didn't fight. He didn't scream anymore. He just hung there a dead weight, his eyes fixed on my back. "Goodbye, Mr. Barnes," the sheriff said softly to me. I didn't turn around. I heard the shuffling of feet. I heard the clinking of chains. I heard the heavy breathing of a man who has lost everything. They dragged him down the aisle. As they reached the doors, Trey let out one last whimper, a soft, broken sound. I closed my eyes. A single tear escaped and rolled down my cheek, getting lost in my collar. It was the last tear I would shed for him. The doors boomed shut. The sanctuary was silent. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of beeswax and lilies. The air tasted clean. I turned to the congregation. They were looking at me with awe and sadness. They knew what it cost a man to cut off his own limb to save the body. I tapped my cane on the floor. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "Yes, Mr. Barnes?" Sarah said, stepping forward from the shadows, her briefcase ready. "Call the locksmith," I said, "and call the real estate agent, not Brittany, a real one." "What are we doing?" Sarah asked. I looked at the empty doorway where my son had just vanished. "We are selling the house," I said. "Selling it. But you fought so hard for it." "I did," I said. "But a house is just wood and brick. Sarah, that house is a crime scene now. It is full of ghosts. I don't want to live with ghosts." I looked up at the stained glass window, at the light pouring through. "I am going to build something new," I said. "Something they can't touch. Something they can't poison." I started to walk down the aisle alone. The sea of people parted for me. I walked with my head high, my cane tapping a rhythm of survival. I was Langston Barnes. I was 72 years old. I had no family left. But as I walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the Chicago afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. I was free. The weeks that followed the arrest were a blur of legal motions and headlines. The story of the prominent Chicago engineer who returned from the dead to testify against his own son became the talk of the city. The newspapers called it the O'Hare miracle, but to me it was just the necessary demolition of a condemned building. I sat in my temporary apartment, a quiet suite in a downtown hotel, and watched the fallout rain down on Trey and Brittany like debris from a controlled explosion. Brittany fell first, and she fell hard. She thought her high-priced lawyer could spin the narrative. She thought she could claim coercion, that she was a victim of Trey's gambling debts. But she forgot about the iPad. She forgot about the trail of digital breadcrumbs she had left in her arrogance. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation didn't wait for the criminal trial. They convened an emergency hearing 3 days after the arrest. I was there. I sat in the back row wearing my charcoal suit, my hands resting on my cane. I watched Brittany try to defend her license. She wasn't wearing her realtor blazer anymore. She was wearing an orange jumpsuit issued by the Cook County Department of Corrections. The board didn't deliberate long. They reviewed the police report. They reviewed the evidence of the forged power of attorney. They listened to the recording of her mocking my dementia. The chairman looked at her with pure disgust. "Mrs. Barnes," he said into the microphone, "you have used your position of trust to exploit the vulnerable. You are a predator in a blazer." He banged the gavel. "Revoked. Permanently." I watched the color drain from her face. That license was her identity. It was her access to the world of luxury she craved. Without it, she wasn't a power player. She was just a criminal with a mortgage she couldn't pay, but the state wasn't done with her. The IRS came next. Thanks to the forensic accounting Sarah and I had handed over, the feds opened an audit into her last 5 years of filings. They found the offshore accounts. They found the shell companies. They found the commission checks she had hidden from the tax man. They seized everything. They put a lock on her condo. They towed her Porsche. They even seized the Hermes Birkin bag she had used to hide my poison. It was auctioned off to pay her back taxes. I watched the auction online. It sold for $8,000. I almost bought it just to burn it, but I decided against it. I didn't want the smoke in my lungs. Brittany was left with nothing. No license, no money, no husband. She was facing 20 years in prison, and when she got out, she would be destitute. The shark had been defanged. Then there was Trey. My son didn't have a license to lose. He didn't have assets to seize. He only had his freedom and his safety, and he lost both the moment I walked out of that church. He was being held in Cook County Jail, denied bail because he was a flight risk. The judge had seen the tickets to the Cayman Islands. But prison wasn't his biggest problem. His biggest problem was the $50,000 he owed to the syndicate. For years they had left him alone because they knew his father was Langston Barnes. They knew I had money. They knew I would pay to keep his legs unbroken. I was his insurance policy. But the news of his arrest changed everything. The news that I had disowned him, testified against him, and cut him out of the will broadcast a clear message to the underworld. Trey Barnes is unprotected. I received a call from a lawyer who represented Trey's court-appointed defense. He sounded shaken. "Mr. Barnes," he said, "your son is in protective custody. He requested it. He says there are men in the general population who are looking for him. He says they work for the people he owes money to." I sat in my hotel room looking out at the Chicago River. "And what do you want me to do?" I asked calmly. "He wants you to pay the debt," the lawyer said. "He says if you pay the $50,000, they will call off the hit. He is begging you, Mr. Barnes. He is terrified." I took a sip of my coffee. It was black, no sugar, no powder. "Tell my son," I said, "that $50,000 is a lot of money." "But sir, it is his life," the lawyer pressed. "I know," I said. "But Trey is a grown man. He borrowed the money. He spent the money. Now he has to settle the account." "But Mr. Barnes..." "Tell him," I said, my voice hardening, "that the bank of Dad is closed. Permanently. Tell him to use the time in his cell to think about the choices that led him there." I hung up. I didn't pay the debt. I let the wolves circle. I knew they wouldn't kill him inside a high-security jail. It was bad for business. But they would make him afraid. They would make him look over his shoulder every second of every day. They would teach him the definition of consequence. Trey was safe from death, but he was not safe from fear. And fear was the only teacher Trey had ever respected. With the criminals handled, I turned my attention to the last piece of the puzzle. The house. I took a taxi to Bronzeville one last time. It was a Tuesday. The street was quiet. The snow had melted, leaving the sidewalks wet and gray. I stood in front of 4512 King Drive. The for sale sign Brittany had put up was gone. In its place was a sign from a different agency. Sold. I walked up the steps. The biometric lock was gone, replaced by a standard deadbolt. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was empty. The furniture was gone, sold, or donated. The curtains were down. The rugs were rolled up. The air smelled of cleaning fluid and emptiness. I walked through the living room. I looked at the spot where the Christmas tree used to stand. I looked at the fireplace where Lucille used to hang the stockings. I looked at the dining room where we had eaten thousands of meals, where I had tried to teach Trey how to do math, where I had laughed and loved. I expected to feel sad. I expected to feel a tearing in my chest. But I felt nothing. The memories were there, but they felt distant, like scenes from a movie I had watched a long time ago. The house had been desecrated. Brittany's greed and Trey's betrayal had seeped into the walls like black mold. I couldn't scrub it out. I couldn't paint over it. Every time I looked at the kitchen island, I saw Brittany crushing pills. Every time I looked at the basement door, I remembered crawling through the dirt to save my own life. This wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. I walked down to the basement one last time. I went into the secret room. It was bare. The safe was open and empty. My blueprints were gone, moved to a secure storage facility. I touched the cinder block wall. "You served me well," I whispered to the house. "You kept me safe, but it is time to let you go." I walked back up to the main floor. Sarah was waiting for me by the door, holding a folder. "The wire transfer came through, Mr. Barnes," she said. $2.5 million. The developer paid a premium for the lot size. I nodded. 2.5 million. It was a fortune. It was enough to buy a villa in Italy. It was enough to live in luxury for the rest of my days. But I didn't want it. That money was blood money. It was the bait that had lured the monsters out of the dark. "Do you have the check, Sarah?" I asked. She nodded. She pulled a cashier's check from the folder. It was made out to the Bronzeville Elder Justice Center. I looked at the check. I looked at the zeros. This organization provided legal aid, safe housing, and medical care for seniors who had been abused or exploited by their families. It was a shield for people who didn't have my engineering skills or my secret safe. I took the check. I signed the back. "Deliver it personally, Sarah," I said. "Tell them it is from Langston and Lucille Barnes. Tell them to use it to build walls that can't be breached." Sarah smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "I will, Mr. Barnes. It will change thousands of lives." I took one last look at the empty living room. "Goodbye," I said. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I left the keys on the hook. I left the memories in the dust. I walked down the steps to the waiting car. The house was gone. The money was gone. The family was gone. I sat in the back seat and adjusted my coat. I felt lighter. I felt clean. "Where to, Mr. Barnes?" the driver asked. "O'Hare Airport," I said. The driver looked at me in the mirror. "You going on a trip, sir?" "Yes," I said, smiling for the first time in months. I pulled my passport from my pocket. The real one. "I have a flight to catch," I said. "Rome, one way." I looked out the window as the city of Chicago rolled past me. The skyline was beautiful, sharp, and strong against the sky. I had helped build it. I had left my mark on the steel and the stone. But my work here was done. I was going to Italy. I was going to drink wine that wasn't poisoned. I was going to design bridges over canals. And I was going to live. Not as a victim, not as a father, but as Langston Barnes, the man who survived. The sun here in Tuscany hits differently than it does in Chicago. In Chicago, the sun is a cold white spotlight that exposes the grime on the sidewalk and the rust on the steel. But here in the village of Lucca, the sun is like warm honey. It pours over the terracotta roofs and the ancient stone walls, turning everything into gold. It warms my bones in a way that the best wool coat never could. I sat at a small iron table outside a cafe overlooking the piazza. It was 10 in the morning. 6 months ago, at 10 in the morning, I would have been sitting in a recliner in a dark room waiting for my daughter-in-law to hand me a cup of poisoned coffee. I would have been staring at a wall trying to remember my own name, wondering why the fog in my brain wouldn't lift. But today, I was not confused. My mind was as sharp as the drafting pencil in my hand. Spread out on the table before me was a large sheet of vellum paper. It was covered in lines and arcs, the language of my soul. The mayor of the village, a boisterous man named Giovanni, had asked me to look at the old footbridge crossing the canal. He heard there was an American engineer living in the villa on the hill. He didn't care about my age, he cared about my eyes. I looked at the sketch. I was designing a new arch. Simple, elegant, using the local limestone but reinforced with a hidden steel spine. It would look like it had been there for centuries, but it would be strong enough to last for centuries more. Lucille would have loved this. We had talked about Italy for 40 years. We bought guidebooks, we looked at pictures, we saved money in that jar on the refrigerator, but we never came. There was always a reason to stay. Trey's tuition, the house repairs, my work. We postponed our joy until it was too late for her. I picked up my espresso. It was dark, rich, and bitter. I drank it in one sip. Then I reached for the bottle of wine. It might seem early for wine, but here nobody judges. I poured a glass of Chianti. The liquid was a deep ruby red swirling in the sunlight. I held the glass up. I looked through it. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have dared to drink this. I would have been terrified that it was spiked with Haldol or scopolamine. I would have wondered if this drink was the one that would stop my heart. But today I didn't check the seal. I didn't sniff for chemicals. I didn't look over my shoulder. I took a long, slow sip. It tasted like cherries and earth. It tasted like trust. I set the glass down and watched the people walking in the square. Mothers pushing strollers, old men playing cards. It was peaceful. It was a world away from the jail cells and the courtrooms of Cook County. The waiter walked over. He was a young man named Marco, who reminded me a little of Andre, the boy who saved my piano. Marco smiled and placed a small stack of mail on my table. "Posta Signore Barnes," he said. "Grazie, Marco," I said. I sifted through the envelopes. A utility bill for the villa, a letter from the Architectural Review Board, a postcard from Sarah, my lawyer, telling me that the donation to the Elder Abuse Center had just funded a new legal defense wing. And then I stopped. At the bottom of the stack was a plain white envelope. It looked cheap. The paper was rough. The stamp was domestic. And in the top left corner, stamped in red ink, were the words Illinois Department of Corrections, Inmate Correspondence. I stared at it. The handwriting on the front was familiar. It was shaky, scrawled with a ballpoint pen, but I recognized the loop of the L and the sharp slant of the B. It was from Trey. I hadn't heard from him since the day the doors of the church slammed shut. I knew he had pleaded guilty. I knew he was serving 12 years. I knew the Aryan Brotherhood and the Vice Lords ran the cell block where he lived. I picked up the envelope. It felt light. I ran my thumb over the seal. Inside this envelope was a voice I hadn't heard in half a year. I knew exactly what the letter would say. I could engineer the sentences in my head before I even read them. He would say he was sorry. He would say he had found God. He would say prison was hard and he was scared. He would ask for money for the commissary. He would ask for a visit. He would try to pull on the string that connected his heart to mine. For a moment I hesitated. The father in me, the old Langston who had built the shelter for the snake, wanted to open it. He wanted to see if maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of the boy I used to love. But then I remembered the coffee. I remembered the cold bench at O'Hare. I remembered the feeling of the wind biting through my coat while I waited for a wheelchair that was never coming. I remembered the look on his face when he laughed about liquidating my life. That man was not my son. That man was a stranger who shared my DNA. And I didn't read letters from strangers. I stood up. I took the letter and my walking stick. I left the sketches on the table. I walked to the edge of the piazza where the stone wall dropped down to the canal below. The water was green and slow-moving, flowing toward the sea. I held the letter over the water. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I felt a sense of structural completion. A bridge connects 2 points, I thought. But sometimes to save the land on one side, you have to destroy the bridge. You have to let the gap be wide and uncrossable. I let go. The white envelope fluttered down. It hit the water with a silent ripple. It floated for a second, the words, "Inmate Correspondence," visible in the sunlight. Then the water soaked into the cheap paper. It turned gray. It grew heavy. And it sank. I watched it disappear into the murky depths of the canal. It was gone. I stood there for a long time watching the water flow over the spot where the letter had vanished. The canal didn't care. The water just kept moving, seeking its own level. I turned around and walked back to my table. Marco was clearing the empty coffee cup. "Everything okay, Signore Barnes?" he asked, seeing my face. "Everything is perfect, Marco," I said. I sat down. I picked up my pencil. I looked at the drawing of the bridge. I drew a strong, solid line across the paper. A new foundation. I was alone in a foreign country. I was 73 years old. I had no family to leave my fortune to. But I wasn't poor. I had the sun. I had the wine. I had the work. And most importantly, I had the silence. The beautiful, honest silence of a man who has nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. I took another sip of wine. To Langston, I whispered to myself, "The man who survived." I went back to work. The bridge wasn't going to build itself. We spend our lives building shelter for our children, ensuring they never feel the rain. But in doing so, we sometimes raise storms that destroy us. I learned that trust is not a birthright, it is a daily wage earned through action. The greatest betrayal didn't happen when they left me at the airport. It happened every time I swallowed my intuition to keep the peace. True strength is realizing that being a parent doesn't mean being a victim. Sometimes you have to burn the bridge you built to stop the enemy from crossing, even if that enemy shares your name. This is Langston Barnes signing off from Italy. If my story opened your eyes, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel growing. And I want to ask you a question in the comments below. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to save yourself? How did you find the courage? Share your story. I read every single one. Until next time, stay strong and keep building.